Thornburgh Family Survival, Chad Thornburgh. Chapter 1. The Day the Lights Went Out, Part 1. Morning in Troy. The morning air in Troy carried that late summer weight, humid, heavy, and lazy in its way. Chad wiped the back of his neck with a rag, the smell of sawdust and sweat hanging thick in the half-finished kitchen. The job was simple enough. Fix a sagging cabinet, plane down a few doors, make an old house look new again. He liked that kind of work. Meant something could still be built right, even in a world that didn't care much about right anymore. Outside, the cicadas whined like a chorus that wouldn't quit. The radio on the counter sputtered with talk shows and weather reports, nothing out of the ordinary, until it didn't. The hum died mid-sentence. The air conditioner stopped. The saw in his hand whined to a stop like a dying breath. He waited for the usual comeback click. Nothing. "Breaker again," he muttered, setting the saw down and heading to the panel. Every light in the house was dead. He stepped outside. Across the street, a woman stood on her porch, waving a useless remote toward her car. By noon, the town was restless. The grocery store parking lot looked like a carnival with no music. Engines idling, people shouting, doors slamming. The cell towers were down too. Tanner called from the shop earlier that morning, voice crackling through the line. "Power's out here too. Pumps ain't working." "Fill what you can and head home," Chad told him. "Bring extra water if you find any." Jacob was at the house, buried in a book when the power died. The kid would read through an earthquake, if you let him. By 3 o'clock, the heat felt like punishment. Chad drove the old Ford through town, the truck rattling over cracked pavement. Radio silent but for static. Gas lines were already backed up. Folks were losing patience. A kid no older than 10 stood by the Hilltop 66 station, holding a cardboard sign. No cash, no gas. A man in a suit shoved another at the pump. Someone shouted about price gouging. A woman cried over her dead phone. It didn't feel like a disaster yet. Not yet. Just confusion. Like everyone was waiting for an announcement to tell them it was all under control. But no voice came. By sundown, Tanner rolled up the drive, his truck bed clinking with water jugs and a 5-gallon gas can. Jacob met him halfway, grinning at the haul. "Only gas I could find," Tanner said, slamming the tailgate shut. "Station shut down right after I filled it. Folks getting mean out there." Chad looked up at the horizon. Street lights should have been blinking on. Instead, dusk fell flat and dark. "Generator's still good," Chad said, though his tone didn't convince even himself. "We'll ride it out like the last time." But deep down, something in his gut whispered different. This wasn't the last time. Part 2. First nightfall. By the time the last of the light drained from the sky, the world had gone quiet in a way Chad had never heard before. No air conditioner hum, no highway rumble, not even the distant bark of a dog. Just the rasp of insects and the faint creak of the old house settling in the heat. He set the generator behind the shed, ran the cord through the window and fired it up. The machine coughed, spat, and finally caught with a low growl. A single bulb blinked to life in the kitchen. The boys stood there in the glow, eyes wide like kids watching a fire they didn't trust. "Keep it low," Chad said. "We don't need to light the county." Tanner nodded and started closing the curtains. Jacob stacked canned food on the counter, 2 days' worth if they stretched it. The boy had always been good with numbers. Now that habit might keep them alive. They ate cold beans straight from the can. The smell of fuel drifted through the open window, mixing with sweat and metal. Tanner kept glancing toward the dark road. "Think it's everywhere?" he asked. "Big enough to knock out half the grid," Chad said. "Could be worse. Could be war?" Chad didn't answer. He'd heard rumors all year. Foreign hacks, fuel shortages, sabers rattling overseas, but it always seemed like background noise. Now it sounded close. Too close. A car rolled past slow, headlights off. The three of them froze. The motor idled, then faded away. Chad let out the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "People get stupid fast when they're scared," he said. "Tomorrow we fill the barrels and lock the place down." He sent the boys to their rooms, sat at the table, and shut off the light. The generator thumped in the yard, steady as a heartbeat. He stared into the darkness where his reflection had been on the window. The old lessons from his grandpa Gentry came back. Don't depend on anybody who sells promises instead of work. Keep tools sharp. Keep faith quiet. Outside, a single gunshot cracked in the distance. Then another. Then silence again. He stood, grabbed the shotgun from behind the door, and stepped onto the porch. The moon hung low and yellow. Somewhere down the road, a dog howled, long and lonely. Tanner's voice came from behind him. "Dad? Go back inside, son. Was that close?" "Close enough." He waited until Tanner's footsteps faded, then sat on the porch rail, shotgun across his knees. The wood felt rough under his palms, solid, familiar. Whatever this blackout was, it was already peeling the paint off civilization, and it had taken less than a day. Tomorrow he'd start the real work, board the windows, draw water, take inventory. Tonight he'd watch the dark and listen for the shape of what was coming. The generator sputtered once, caught again, and kept humming. In its rhythm he heard the same steady beat that had carried him his whole life. Measure twice, cut once, stand your ground. The world had gone still, but Chad Thornburgh hadn't. Part 3. The second day morning came gray and close, a fog sitting low over the fields like breath on glass. Chad woke before the sun, same as always, habit, not alarm clocks. The generator had gone quiet sometime in the night, and the house felt hollow without its low hum. He brewed the last of the coffee on the camp stove, the smell filling the kitchen. Tanner stumbled in, rubbing his eyes. Jacob right behind him, clutching a notebook full of numbers and sketches. "Fuel's down to half a can," Tanner said. "Then we run on daylight from here," Chad answered. "No more wasting gas to keep the lights pretty." He set his mug down and turned toward the radio that had sat on the counter since before Tanner was born. An old shortwave set Jim Gentry once used to talk with truckers and other old-timers. Dust clung to its dials, but the thing was built like a tractor. Chad flipped the switch. For a long minute there was nothing but a low hiss, the static rolling like waves on gravel. Then a voice cracked through, faint and warped. "Repeat. Major grid failure. Communications down, across." The rest drowned in noise. He fine-tuned the dial with a carpenter's patience until the voice bled back in. "Not a storm. This is coordinated. Stay home, stay armed, conserve fuel." Then silence again. Jacob looked up wide-eyed. "Dad, that was real. Someone's still broadcasting." "Someone's trying," Chad said. He tapped the radio's side, listening to the static fade. "Means we're on our own till they figure out how to shout louder." Outside, a pickup crawled past the crossroads, men standing in the bed with rifles. Not uniforms, just locals wearing nerves and dust. The sight turned Chad's stomach in a way no war report ever had. He shut the curtains. "From now on, Nobody opens that door unless I say so. If somebody needs help, they can holler from the fence." Tanner nodded. Jacob hesitated, then said quietly, "That's not who we are." Chad met his eyes. "That's who we have to be, till we know what's coming." They spent the rest of the day turning the house into a fortress. Plywood over the windows, rain barrels under the eaves, tools and nails sorted like ammunition. Every hammer strike felt final. When the last board was up, Chad stood on the porch, sweat running down his neck. The sky was bright and empty, too calm for how the world felt. He could hear the old radio humming faintly through the open window, a ghost of a signal, someone somewhere still calling out into the static. He thought of his mother, Betty, teaching him to fix what breaks because no one else will. He thought of his grandfather's hands guiding his on a saw handle. He whispered under his breath, almost a prayer, "All right then." We build again. And with that, he turned back inside, ready to start the next day of the new world. Chapter 2. 2. The road out. The generator gave up on the second night. Chad didn't bother cursing it. He'd already expected it. Fuel was worth more than comfort now. At dawn, he stood at the kitchen window, coffee gone cold, watching the sky turn copper behind the trees. A low hum of insects filled the silence. The radio hissed quietly on the counter, a ghost still whispering through the static but never forming words. It had been 3 days. No power, no news, no trucks on the highway. And now the neighbors were knocking. First came Old Man Givens from across the field, hat in hand, asking if Chad had spare gas for his generator. Then came a mother with 2 small kids, eyes red, asking if she could fill water from the rain barrel. He let them both, but the line forming at the end of his driveway told him what came next. Need turns to envy. Envy turns to danger. When he stepped back inside, Tanner and Jacob were waiting. "What do we do?" Tanner asked. "We leave," Chad said. "Today." Jacob looked up from the table, glasses sliding down his nose. "Leave Troy before Troy stops being Troy." They loaded what mattered, tools, the shotgun, ammo, seed packets, and what food hadn't spoiled. Tanner hauled fuel cans from the shed. Jacob packed books, rope, and a handful of batteries that might still have juice. By mid-morning, the old Ford's bed was stacked high, tarped tight. Chad walked a slow circle around it, checking the straps like he was cinching down a lifetime. "You sure about this?" Tanner asked. "World's breaking loose. We'll find somewhere quiet till it settles. And if it doesn't, then we'll build quiet ourselves." The highway out of town looked like a junkyard. Cars sat nose to tail, some still with people inside, windows cracked for air. Others were empty, doors hanging open, contents scattered like driftwood. Chad kept the truck crawling along the shoulder. Every so often he'd see someone wave for help, and Jacob's hand would twitch toward the door handle. "Don't," Chad said, eyes on the road. "We can't just drive past them." "We can this time. That's the difference between living and joining the pile." They turned off the main road onto a gravel lane that ran north toward the river. Fewer cars, fewer eyes. The sun climbed and heat shimmered off the hood. By evening, they'd reached a small crossroads where an old store leaned sideways against itself. The windows were smashed, shelves bare. Tanner checked behind the counter and came back holding a dusty map. "Looks like there's farmland past the ridge," he said. "Good. We'll camp there tonight." They parked under a cluster of oaks, built a small fire, and ate canned chili cold. Coyotes yipped somewhere far off. Jacob leaned against his pack. "Dad, What if it's all gone? The power, the cities. What if it doesn't come back? Chad stared into the fire. Then we make do. People forget. Civilization's just a coat of paint. Underneath, we still know how to work wood and grow food. That's enough to start again. When the fire burned low, he took first watch. The night smelled of dust and cut grass. He listened to the engine tick as it cooled and thought of home, the shop, the jobs lined up for next week, the normal life that had been snuffed out like a blown fuse. He didn't feel fear, so much as certainty. The world had shifted, and from here on, every choice counted. Just before dawn, the horizon lit faintly. An orange bloom far to the east. Maybe a refinery, maybe something worse, Chad said. Time to move. They climbed into the truck as the first light touched the fields, tires crunching over gravel, leaving Troy behind. Ahead waited land, work, and the quiet promise of survival. They rolled out just after dawn, fog curling low over the gravel lane. The Ford bumped along slow, the sun still hidden behind a pale ridge. Then Chad saw them. Two men standing in the middle of the road, one tall and wiry, the other built like a post. Both had that look that said they'd been sizing up strangers for days. Chad eased the truck to a stop. Jacob, behind the truck. Tanner, keep watch. He stepped out, boots crunching gravel. The men didn't move. We're just passing through, Chad called. No trouble needed. The taller one flicked a cigarette into the dust and smiled like he owned the road. Road tax, he said. Fuel or food. Nobody rides free anymore. Chad's glared at them. You'd best move aside. We don't pay for roads that ain't yours. The man took a step closer, hand hovering too near his belt. Tanner's voice came sharp from behind the truck with long rifle pointed at the second man. Dad, hold, Chad said quietly. For a breath, the world held still. Then something in the air shifted. Danger, thick as the heat. Chad's tone went iron hard. Last warning, friend. Take that step and it will be your last, lifting the edge of his jacket to reveal a .45 pistol. The man hesitated, eyes flicking to his partner, then backed away a half step. Something in Chad's face, or maybe the calm behind his words, told them this wasn't a bluff. After a long pause, they stepped aside. Chad nodded once, got back in the truck, and the Ford rumbled past. Nobody spoke until the road bent out of sight. Jacob finally asked, Would you have done it? Chad looked ahead. Son, he said quietly, I hope I never have to, but I won't let anyone take what keeps my family alive. The boy said nothing more. Tanner kept the rifle across his lap, eyes on the mirror. Behind them, the road emptied back into fog. Chapter 3. 3. The farm. The road wound north into rolling fields, the kind of ground that used to smell like summer rain and diesel. Now it just smelled empty. They drove for hours, avoiding main routes, watching the fuel gauge sink lower. The only sounds were the rumble of the old Ford and the soft rattle of tools in the bed. By mid-afternoon, the gravel thinned to dirt. Jacob leaned forward between the seats, map open in his lap. There's a creek about a mile ahead, he said. Past that, looks like old farmland. Big plots. Big means room, Chad said. Room means we can breathe. They crossed the creek and followed a narrow lane choked with weeds. An old mailbox leaned at the edge of the brush, its paint worn to ghosts of letters. Past it sat a house half collapsed on one side, windows black with rot. But behind it, a barn stood tall, roof rusted but whole. The land stretched wide, wild, overgrown, but untouched. Chad pulled the truck into the drive and killed the engine. For a long minute, none of them spoke. Then he said, "This'll do." They walked the property in slow circles, boots crunching dry grass. The barn was solid, built from thick beams that hadn't lost their backbone. The well pump still moved when Tanner leaned his weight into it, groaning but giving a trickle of brown water. There were fences half buried in weeds, tools rusting in the dirt, a tractor frozen midfield like a monument to work that never finished. "Feels right," Tanner said quietly. "It'll take work," Chad replied, "but work we can do." They unloaded what they had: tools, seed, canned food, the few comforts left, and stacked it all in the barn. Tanner set up a tarp for sleeping. Jacob cleared space near the door for a fire pit. When dusk came, the three of them sat by the low flame, eating beans and crackers, watching the horizon burn red under the setting sun. "Think anyone else knows about this place?" Jacob asked. "Maybe once," Chad said. "Not now. World's too busy breaking." He looked around at the quiet fields and the barn's dark outline. "We'll start fixing it tomorrow. Roof first, then the well. Once water's clean, we plant." Tanner poked the fire with a stick. "Feels strange. Like we ran out here and just stopped." Chad nodded. "That's what building is, son. It's what you do when everything else stops." The night settled in, thick and still. Coyotes called far off. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the smell of dust and old wood. Chad lay awake long after the fire died, listening to every creak of the barn. The place felt tired but not dead, just waiting for hands to bring it back to life. He thought of his mother's voice from years ago. "You can fix anything if you don't quit halfway." He closed his eyes on that thought and let sleep come slow. Chapter 4. 4. The New World days bled into weeks. The rhythm of work came back like muscle memory. Every morning before dawn, Chad was up with a hammer in his hand and the smell of wet wood in his nose. The first week, they patched the barn roof with tin pulled from the collapsed house. Tanner handled the heavy lifting. Jacob ran measurements and kept notes in his little notebook, writing every fix like it was a map to the future. When the well finally coughed up clean water, the three of them just stood there for a while, drinking from cupped hands, grinning like fools. "First win," Tanner said. "First of many," Chad replied. They rigged barrels under the gutters, cleared brush from the old field, and marked a small patch for late crops: beans, squash, potatoes. It wasn't much, but it was life again. By the second week, the silence that had felt heavy started to feel like peace. No traffic, no sirens, no noise but the wind and the scrape of tools. Chad liked it that way. Still, the radio kept whispering. Every evening he'd tune the shortwave, trying to catch a voice worth believing. Mostly it was static, sometimes garbled words: northern cities dark, movement west, safe zones compromised. No one said the war had started, but it didn't need to be said. You could hear it in the static. One afternoon, a figure came walking down the gravel lane. A man, thin, clothes torn, eyes hollow. Tanner spotted him first and called out. Chad came from the barn with the shotgun at his side, not raised but not hidden either. The man stopped 10 yards short. "Ain't looking for trouble," he said, voice rough. "Just food or a drink?" Chad studied him. The man looked beat but not sick, just worn down. "Sit by the fence," Chad said. "Jacob, get him some water." They watched as the stranger drank, thanked them, and stood. "You folks got it good here eating," he said, eyes sweeping the land. "Won't last. Gangs working the back roads, taking what they find. Appreciate the warning. Chad said. "Now move along." The man hesitated like he might argue, then saw something in Chad's face and turned down the road. When he was gone, Tanner said, "You think he was scouting us?" "Doesn't matter," Chad answered. "Next time, we'll be ready either way." That night he posted watches, Tanner first, himself second. Jacob wanted a turn, but Chad shook his head. "Not yet. You'll know when you're ready." At midnight he walked the fence line, moonlight silvering the fields. The air felt stretched thin, like calm before a storm. He stopped by the gate and looked back at the barn where his boys slept. Everything he loved was inside those walls. The thought wasn't comforting, it was heavy, because love meant you'd fight for it. He whispered to the dark, "We're not just surviving out here. We're starting over." And from somewhere far off, a faint rumble rolled through the night. Not thunder, not yet war, but something big moving just beyond hearing. Chapter 5. 5. Ghosts in the Sky. The rumble came back 3 nights later. This time it wasn't distant. Chad woke to the sound, low and steady, like thunder trapped under the ground. The walls of the barn trembled just enough to rattle a hammer off the shelf. He sat up fast, heart already ahead of his thoughts. Tanner was at the door before he could speak, rifle in hand, eyes searching the horizon. "What is it?" Jacob asked, voice thick with sleep. "Not a storm," Chad said. "Too even, too heavy." They stepped out into the night. The moon hung low, pale, against a sky streaked faintly red to the north. The sound kept rolling, deep, mechanical, layered with a distant whistle that rose and fell like wind through a tunnel. Tanner frowned. "You think it's planes?" "Not ours," Chad said. "No one's got ours anymore." For nearly an hour the noise came and went, fading into silence, then returning like an echo that couldn't find home. When it finally stopped, the air felt hollow, like the world had held its breath and forgotten how to let go. By morning a thin haze had settled over the fields. Ash, maybe, or dust, from somewhere burning far off. The sun looked pale and sick through it. They worked anyway. It's what Thornburghs did when the world didn't make sense, kept their hands busy. Tanner patched fences, Jacob checked the barrels, Chad rebuilt the old chicken coop even though there were no chickens yet. The work steadied them. Around noon, the radio crackled to life again. A woman's voice this time, faint but clear. "Southern lines compromised, fallout, remain sheltered." Then static. Then nothing. Jacob turned toward his dad. "Fallout?" Chad shook his head. Could mean anything. Could mean smoke from the plants east of the river. Tanner said nothing, but his face told another story. He'd seen that kind of sky before in old photos. That evening, they brought everything inside the barn. No fire, no lanterns. The air smelled faintly metallic, and dust drifted down through the roof seams like snow. Chad sat with the radio in his lap, turning the dial slow, his face lit only by the green glow of its numbers. He remembered being a kid, sitting with his granddad in the same kind of silence, listening for weather reports on a battery set during storms. Back then the world had felt big but safe. Now it just felt big. When? Jacob finally broke the quiet. His voice was barely a whisper. "You think Grandma's okay? Or Jack?" Chad looked at the boy, the words catching in his throat. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I'm sure they will find us if they're out there. They're doing what we are. Holding on." The wind picked up outside, carrying the smell of rain mixed with something sour. Tanner leaned against the wall, rifle across his knees, and said quietly, "Feels like we're sitting on the edge of something." Chad nodded. "We are. And when it tips, we'll be ready." The radio hissed once more, a burst of static sharp as a spark, then fell silent. The barn creaked in the wind, and the night stretched long. Above, faint streaks of light moved through the clouds, too straight for stars, too slow for planes. Jacob whispered, "Ghosts in the sky." Chad didn't answer. He just watched them fade, knowing deep down that whatever was coming next would change everything again. Chapter 6. 6. The Visitors. Part 1. Strangers at the Fence. By late autumn, the air had that sharp smell of cold metal and wood smoke. The days were shorter now, but work didn't slow. The fields were cleared, the barn patched tight against winter, and the fences mended where the posts had rotted. Life had found a rhythm, quiet, steady, simple. Then one morning it broke. Chad was splitting kindling when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Slow, cautious. He looked up to see a rusted SUV creeping down the lane, its front bumper dragging weeds. "Company," Tanner called from the barn loft. His voice didn't carry panic, but it was sharp enough to make Jacob come running from the shed, wiping his hands on his jeans. The SUV stopped about 50 yards out. 3 figures got out, 2 men and a young woman. The oldest man, gray in the beard and bent at the shoulders, raised an open hand in greeting. "Stay put," Chad said, setting the axe down. He walked forward a few paces, stopping by the gate. "That's far enough." The gray-bearded man nodded. "Don't mean to trespass. We're just looking for a place to rest today. My boy's hurt, and the girl ain't eaten since yesterday." Chad studied them. The younger man leaned against the SUV, his arm wrapped in a stained bandage. The girl, maybe 16, clutched a backpack to her chest. Her eyes darted everywhere, the barn, the fields, the rain barrels. "You folks from around here?" Chad asked. "Started out near Wentzville," the man said. "Been moving west. Towns are dried up or burned out. Heard there were still farms holding steady this way." Chad didn't answer. He could feel Tanner's eyes on them from the loft window. Knew his son already had the rifle sighted if this went sideways. "You got food?" Chad asked. "Some," the man said, hesitating. "We can trade. Medicine, maybe. Tools." That last word caught Chad's ear. Tools meant history. Tools meant they'd been somewhere worth staying once. "Leave your packs there," Chad said. "You can sit by the fence and eat what I bring out. But nobody comes past the wire." The man nodded, weary relief flickering across his face. "Fair enough. Name's Bill. This here's my boy, Nate, and my niece Lila." He helped the girl sit in the grass while Chad went back to the house. Jacob was waiting by the door. "You trust them?" "No," Chad said, "but they're cold and hungry. That's a kind of truth you can see from a mile off." He filled a pot with water and set it to boil on the stove. From a jar he took what beans they could spare, added salt, and carried the pot out with 3 tin cups. Bill thanked him, voice rough. The girl smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't last. The younger man, Nate, just stared at the barn, eyes tracing the lines of the roof, counting windows. Chad noticed. "You got questions about something?" he asked. Nate blinked, forcing a grin. "Just admiring craftsmanship." Chad didn't smile back. They ate in silence. The smell of the beans drifted through the cold air, and for a few minutes it almost felt like the old world again. Strangers sharing a meal without fear. But only almost. When they were done, Bill stood and wiped his hands. "We're obliged to you. Didn't expect kindness this far out." Wasn't kindness, Chad said. Was decency. Don't mistake the two. Bill's smile faded, but he nodded. Fair enough. They gathered their things, the girl pausing to glance back once, a quiet thank you in her eyes. The younger man didn't. As the SUV rattled away, Tanner came down from the loft, rifle slung over his shoulder. You see how the younger one was looking. Around? I did, Chad said. You think they'll come back? Maybe. Chad stared down the road where the dust was still settling. But next time, we'll be ready for it. That night, they doubled the watches. The air was so still you could hear the frost forming on the windows. From the dark came the faintest echo. Maybe wind, maybe tires on gravel again. But by morning it was gone. Chad stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the horizon turn pale. He'd wanted to believe that goodwill might still mean something. But out here, kindness was a luxury that could get a man killed. Still, he found himself hoping that the girl, Lila, made it somewhere safe. He couldn't help it. The sun was sinking when Chad heard another engine on the road. His stomach tightened. Once in a day was already too many visitors. He motioned Tanner toward the barn and waved Jacob to the side of the house. The vehicle stopped at the gate. A familiar voice called out, soft but certain, Chad, boys, that you out there? He froze. For a second he thought his mind was playing tricks, but then the door opened, and there she was, Betty Thornburgh, shorter now, gray streaks in her hair catching the light of the setting sun. Beside her climbed out Jack, her husband 4, the past 15 years. Mom, Chad said, stepping forward. Betty smiled through tears. You left us a note, sweetheart, pinned to the fridge. Jacob's handwriting said you were heading northwest to find land. We just followed the map and prayed the truck would hold together. Jacob blinked. You found that? I didn't think anyone would see it. Jack came around the truck, shaking his head with a faint grin. Wasn't easy. Roads are worse than war zones, and Troy's mostly empty now. But your mom wasn't about to quit. Not till she knew her boys were alive. Chad felt his throat close up. He opened the gate himself, and Betty rushed into his arms. He hugged her tight, breathing in the smell of her hair, wood smoke and lavender, same as when he was a kid. I knew you'd be all right, she said against his shoulder. You're a Thornburgh. You don't break easy. Jack shook Tanner's hand, then clapped Jacob on the shoulder. You both grown into men. Your old man here's done right by you. Chad smiled faintly. We've been lucky. The land's good to us. Luck's got nothing to do with it, Jack said. Hard work and stubborn hearts. That's what this family's built from. They unloaded what little they'd brought. 2 gas cans, blankets, a box of canned peaches, and a small bundle of letters from the old mailbox in Troy. Betty handed them to Chad. They'll get delivered now. I couldn't bear to leave them behind. That night they sat by the fire out back. Betty told them how quiet Troy had become, how the neighbors had vanished one by one, how the nights got darker each week. She and Jack had waited as long as they could before deciding to go. When the talk turned to tomorrow, Chad looked across the fire at his mother, her face lined but strong. You're safe here now. This place. It's home. She smiled, eyes glistening in the firelight. As long as you're here, it always has been. Jack leaned back, letting out a long breath. Feels good to stop running. Chad nodded slowly. Yeah, but let's not pretend we're done. The world out there hasn't forgotten us. It just hasn't found us yet. He looked at his family, all gathered under the soft glow of the fire. For the first time since the lights went out, the farm felt like something more than survival. It felt like belonging. Part 2. Barter and Boundaries. The first frost came early that year. It silvered the fields in the morning, turned every breath into smoke. Chad stood on the porch with his coffee, staring across the land that now held 3 generations under one roof: his mother, her husband, his boys, and him. The farm finally looked alive again. But the peace wouldn't last. It never did. The day started with Jack walking up from the lower fence line, breath steaming in the cold. "2 fellows on horseback down near the creek," he said. "Didn't come close, but they saw the smoke." Chad nodded. "Let's see what they want before they decide for us." By mid-morning, the riders appeared at the edge of the drive, rough-looking, wrapped in mismatched coats, rifles slung casual, but not hidden. They reined in by the fence and waved. "Morning," the older one said. "Name's Clyde. This here's Reese. We've got a spread down by the river, 5 miles east. Heard there were folks up this way who could work a fair trade." Chad stepped forward just enough to meet their eyes. "What kind of trade?" "Salt, matches, a few gallons of gas," Clyde said. "We're looking for grain or nails. Maybe some spare hand tools if you've got 'em." Tanner came out of the barn wiping his hands, the set of his shoulders saying he didn't trust them. Jacob lingered behind him with his notebook, already cataloging what they actually could afford to lose. Betty watched from the porch, arms folded. Jack stood just off to the side, eyes sharp, hand near his belt. Chad weighed the offer. Tools were worth more than salt, but they needed good relations with anyone within walking distance. In this new world, isolation wasn't safety. It was a slow death. "All right," he said finally. "You bring your goods tomorrow. We'll see what's fair." Clyde grinned. "Fair's good. Neighbors ought to help each other." When they rode off, Tanner muttered, "They'll come back whether we want 'em or not." "Then we make sure it's worth their while to stay friendly," Chad said, though something in his gut already felt uneasy. The next day, the men returned with a small wagon and 2 more riders. They brought salt, matches, and a jug of kerosene. In exchange, Chad gave them a half sack of grain and a box of nails. The trade went smooth, too smooth. That night, after everyone had turned in, Tanner came into the kitchen, carrying the toolbox they kept by the door. His face was tight. "Dad," he said quietly, "the brace and bit's gone. So's the 10-inch wrench." Chad looked up from the table. "You sure?" "I counted before the trade. They're not here now." He stood slowly, every muscle going still. Theft wasn't just theft anymore. It was a message. "Could have been any one of them," Tanner said. "Could have been the boy, Reese. He kept eyeing the barn." "Could have been," Chad said, voice flat. "Or could have been we let people too close before we learned what kind they were." He didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the barn made his hand reach for the pistol on the nightstand. When dawn came, he was already at the workbench, oiling the rifle and staring through the window at the frost. Betty came in, wrapping her shawl tight. "You're up early." "Didn't sleep." She poured coffee, set it in front of him, and said softly, "You're turning into your grandfather." He half smiled. "That a warning or a compliment?" "Both," she said. "He didn't trust easily either, but he always gave folks one last chance before he made up his mind. Just remember that." Outside, the sun lifted through the haze, lighting the frost like glass. "Maybe one last chance," Chad said. After that, we closed the gates for good. Part 3. Night Fire. Winter crept in quiet, cold, and dry. The ground froze hard enough that footsteps cracked the frost at dawn. Chad had learned to read the air by now, could smell snow before the sky even turned. After the trouble with the missing tools, he decided they needed better sight lines. "If folks can see us," he told Tanner, "then we damn sure better see them first." They spent the next week reclaiming the old concrete silo that stood 50 yards from the barn. The lower half had cracked from age, but the top was solid. Thick walls, high vantage. Perfect. Jacob suggested the plan first, tracing it out in the dirt with a stick. "If we chip through here, here, and here," he said, "you'll get a full 360-degree field. Overlaps every angle of approach." Tanner grinned. "Boy's got an engineer's brain." "Boy's got my mother's patience," Chad said, patting his shoulder. They went at it with chisels and hammers, carving narrow sight holes into the silo wall. Cold dust filled the air, the echo of steel on stone ringing across the yard. Tanner fitted each opening with metal, flashing scavenged from an old truck hood. When they were done, the tower looked born for war, quiet, sturdy, unbreakable. Inside, they built a spiral of old ladder rungs leading to a small platform at the top. From there, you could see for miles the creek to the east, the burned-out stretch of road to the south, and the endless dark of the tree line beyond. Betty called it the lighthouse, though no light burned from it. When the work on the silo was done, Chad started the next project, a log cabin for his mom and Jack. "You two deserve walls that hold heat," he said, "not drafty barn air." Jack protested at first, but when Betty gave him that look only mothers have, he just sighed and grabbed an axe. They hauled deadfall from the woods, stripped bark, and notched each log with careful precision. Every thud of the mallet, every grunt of effort felt like a statement. "We're not leaving. This land is ours now." It was near midnight, a week later, when Tanner shook Chad awake. "Fire," he said. They ran out into the cold. Orange light pulsed from the lower field, too far from the house to be an accident. The air stank of kerosene. "Jack, get the pump going," Chad barked. "Tanner, grab buckets. Jacob, wake your grandma and get her inside the barn. Keep her low." They sprinted through the dark, boots pounding frozen dirt. The fire danced at the edge of the new fence, flames curling up dry grass toward the silo. Tanner beat at it with a shovel, while Chad hauled water from the barrel. Jack worked the pump, his breath fogging in the firelight. It took nearly half an hour to choke the flames down to blackened ash. When it was over, Tanner stood hunched, sweat steaming in the cold. "That wasn't wind or lightning, Dad. Someone poured that fuel." Chad nodded grimly. He knelt and picked up a melted plastic jug half buried in the dirt. The smell of kerosene was still strong. "Clyde and Reese," he said. "Had to be. They wanted us spooked or driven off." "Or dead," Jack added. Chad looked toward the tree line, eyes narrow. "Then we start watching both sides of the fence." The next morning, smoke still hung low over the fields. Jacob climbed the silo ladder with a pair of binoculars and didn't come down for an hour. When he did, he said, "Dad, there's a campfire down by the creek. 2 people, maybe 3. Can't see their faces, but they've been watching." Chad just nodded. "Let 'em watch. They'll see what happens when you set fire to Thornburgh land." That night, no one slept. The watchtower stayed manned in shifts. The wind howled through the chipped holes in the concrete, making a low, eerie whistle. Betty called it the ghost singing, But Chad knew better. It was the sound of warning. The next morning, the campfire by the creek was gone. Just smoke and footprints leading east. But the feeling stayed that the world outside was testing them, measuring their resolve. As Chad looked up at the silo standing tall against the gray sky, he realized something. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were building a stronghold, one log, one nail, one heartbeat at a time. Chapter 7. 7. Holding the line. The cold bit deeper with each morning. Frost glittered on the fences, and the air carried the smell of diesel, pine, and smoke. Winter was coming hard, but Chad felt something different in his gut this time. Not fear, not desperation. Purpose. He'd spent too long reacting. Now, it was time to prepare. The new fence started in the south field. Tanner drove posts while Chad unrolled barbed wire and Jack anchored each corner with salvaged rebar and old railroad ties. The fence ran in jagged lines, ugly but strong. Where wood was scarce, they stacked rocks and broken brick into low walls, country engineering at its best. "Won't stop bullets," Tanner said, setting another post. "No," Chad answered, "but it'll slow men down long enough for us to see 'em coming." Jacob worked quietly nearby, setting small tripwire alarms from scrap tin and rope. When he tripped one by accident, and it let out a sharp metallic clang, Tanner nearly jumped out of his skin. Jacob grinned behind his glasses. "That's the point." They added motion bells to the gate, concealed behind brush, and dug a shallow trench along the back fence where the ground dipped toward the creek. By week's end, the Thornburgh farm looked less like a home and more like a fortress. The next job was the house. The old farmhouse was too far gone, roof caved, walls split, rot eating through the floors. But the cellar beneath it still held strong. That's where Chad saw his chance. "Logs," he said one morning, staring at the tree line. "Tight built, double thick. You can patch holes in wood. Can't do that with drywall." Jack chuckled. "Bulletproof and warm. You're thinking like a man who means to stay. Means to die here, if it comes to that," Chad said. They felled timber from the north ridge, cutting notches clean and fitting each log tight with pegs. Jacob drew out the design on paper. Small footprint, heavy roof, narrow windows with shutters that locked from inside. The old cellar entrance sat dead center under the foundation. Chad worked it so the trap door blended with the new plank floor. Hidden, silent, impossible to see unless you knew it was there. They reinforced the cellar walls with old bricks from the collapsed chimney and coated them in tar to keep moisture out. Tanner installed shelving from scrap lumber. By the time they were done, the place could hold 6 people, a month's worth of food, and a small generator. Betty called it the burrow. When the first hard snow hit, the cabin was nearly done. Walls up, roof sealed, chimney smoking. The smell of fresh-cut pine filled the air. Chad stood back, arms crossed, and took it in. "It ain't pretty," Tanner said, brushing sawdust from his beard. "It's ours," Chad replied. That night, as the wind rose, the first real test came. The storm rolled in from the west like a freight train, wind screaming through the trees, sleet hammering the roof, the silo howling like a beast. Chad made the call. "Everyone below now." They filed down into the cellar, Betty clutching her shawl, Jack carrying a lantern, Jacob already counting supplies, Tanner sealing the door behind them. The storm hit full force, shaking the walls but never breaching them. For 3 hours they sat by the lantern's dim light, listening to the world rage above. Betty reached over, squeezing Chad's hand. "Your granddad would have been proud of this. He always said you had a builder's heart." Chad smiled faintly. "Guess he taught me right. Build like you mean to last." When the storm passed, they climbed back up to a silent, snow-covered dawn. The fence stood. The silo still loomed watchful. The house, though dusted in frost, hadn't given an inch. Chad looked over the frozen land and said quietly, "This'll hold." The quiet didn't last. 2 nights later, Tanner was on watch up in the silo. The stars were sharp and cold overhead, and the horizon was clear as a blade. Chad was in the barn sorting tools when he heard the faint clink of the warning bell by the back fence. He froze. One ring, then another. "Tanner," he called. From above came a low voice. "We got movement. 4 shapes. Backfield. Coming slow." Chad grabbed the lantern and snuffed it out. Darkness closed in. He slipped out the side door and moved along the fence line until he could see the slope of the back pasture. 4 figures creeping low, rifles slung, Clyde and his men. Chad's heart thudded once, steady and solid. He raised a hand toward the tower, a signal Tanner knew by heart. The night split with the clean crack of a single rifle shot. The sound rolled through the valley like thunder. Sparks flashed near the intruders. One man's rifle twisted in his grip. The barrel split clean. The silence that followed was deep enough to choke on. Then Tanner's voice rang out, calm but caring. "That's your warning shot. Next one goes where it's aimed." For a long second, no one moved. Then Clyde raised both hands and barked something Chad couldn't make out. The group hesitated, turned, and began retreating into the dark the way they came. Chad stayed still until their silhouettes vanished beyond the tree line. Only then did he let the air leave his lungs. When Tanner climbed down from the tower, his hands were shaking slightly. Chad met him halfway. "Good call," Chad said quietly. "You stopped it before it started." Tanner nodded, eyes still scanning the ridge. "They'll be back." "Maybe," Chad said, gripping his shoulder. "But they'll think hard before walking this way again." They walked back toward the house, the lantern light flickering against the new logs of the cabin. Betty was waiting on the porch, arms folded, face calm but proud. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Was," Chad said. "And will be, long as we stay ready." She nodded, satisfied. "Then get some rest. Tomorrow's another build day." As the family filed inside, Chad looked once more toward the back fence. The farm stood quiet again, fences holding, tower watching, the hidden cellar waiting below. For the first time in a long while, he felt the strength of what they'd built. Chad walks into barn and see Betty looking out the window. "Mom, you miss town." She didn't look surprised. "I miss sitting at the diner with coffee in a cracked mug, watching the morning roll in. I miss the gossip and the mail and the papers that told us what to worry about. Funny thing, now the nights are quieter, but I feel lonelier than when they were loud." She gave a small, honest laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm just glad our family is together and healthy." Chad leaned on the rail and didn't offer the usual answers. There weren't the old comforts to hand her, no easy fixes, but he felt it too, the father's ache that comes when the job is done and there's nothing left to do but wait. "You'll have folks to talk to," he said. "We're starting to see more people moving through. Could be someone decent. Could be not." She studied his face for a long moment. "If someone comes who knows how to mend hands and hearts, You let them stay near the fire for a while." He didn't argue. He'd learned not to promise what he couldn't keep. Still, the thought of a neighbor who could set bones or stitch a wound made the nights feel less empty. But under it all, he could still hear his mother's voice echoing softly, "Don't turn her away." The snow had melted to mud and new grass, and the farm felt alive again. Solid walls, a watchtower that saw clear to the horizon, fences tight enough to turn strangers away. It was a fine thing. But even with the land humming with work, Betty could see what her son tried to hide. He'd built safety for everyone else and left none for himself. At supper one night, Betty thought as she watched Chad across the table, face lit by lantern glow, beard flecked with gray now, hands rougher than ever. Tanner and Jacob traded jokes. Jack teased her about her biscuits, but Chad barely spoke. He smiled when someone caught his eye, then looked past them like he was listening to something that wasn't there. After the boys went to bed, she found him out on the porch, coat half zipped, eyes on the tree line. The night was clear and quiet, stars sharp above the barn roof. "You've done good work here," she said softly. "Never feels done," he replied. "Work never is, but family's the reward." She let the silence hang a beat, then added, "You built a fine place, Chad. Maybe time you thought about who you're building it for." He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "Son, a man can carry a hammer his whole life and never build a home unless he's got somebody beside him who sees the same sky." He didn't answer. Betty smiled, touched his arm, and turned back toward the door. "You'll figure it out. Someone will find her way here one day. A place like this. It calls good hearts." She left him standing in the cold, that thought sinking deeper than he'd admit. By the time the thaw finally loosened the ground, the farm had become a place people watch for. Word moves in its own way now. Traders, scouts, eyes in the tree line. Chad kept the watch shift strict. He did not want surprises. Then Clyde came back. They didn't approach the lane this time. Clyde and 3 of his men threaded their way along the back fence, using saplings and drift brush as cover. One of them moved with a limp. They thought they were being careful. They thought wrong. Chad was in the loft, checking the lock on a shutter, when he heard a sound like a twig, snapping, not loud, but clear. Tanner was on the silo that morning, doing another sweep through the hungry horizon, and Jacob had just gone up the ladder with a pair of binoculars. Chad felt the tension before he saw the men. The way the dogs fell silent, the angle of the light, the tiny puff of dust where boots had pressed the earth. He stepped to the silo ladder and found Tanner already half out on the platform, rifle steady, chin down, eyes on the far field. Below him, the 3 figures had crept to within about 200 yards of the fence and stopped. They were young enough to be cocky and old enough to know how to hold that posture. One unrolled a tarp, another hefted a rifle and pointed it, not quite aiming but showing intent. Chad's mouth went dry. For years he'd taught his boys to let people be, until people proved otherwise. Now the proof was close enough to spit. Tanner didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He set the crosshairs, breathed slow as he'd learned at the range, and picked a target not on a man but on a thing the men had brought to show their seriousness. A long-barreled rifle, propped and aimed the wrong way. Tanner's plan was a clean message, nothing messy. The report cracked across the field like a thrown rock. The sound split the air. Where the line of men had been, the rifle they had propped jerked violently and split into two pieces as if something hard had struck it true, the muzzle whipping aside. The man closest to it cursed, stepping back so fast he almost lost his footing. From the silo, Tanner called down, voice flat, low enough for only those up close to hear. "That's a warning shot. Next one won't be your gear." For a terrible heartbeat, everything hung there. The drizzle of dust, the men with hands half raised, the farm's line of fence and the cold trenches just beyond. Then Clyde, who'd been the one to slide forward at the fence, barked something not quite a laugh and backed away, hand on his chest as if to say he meant no more trouble. They gathered themselves, eyes sharp and angry, and retreated the way they'd come, a cloud of dust swallowing their footprints. Chad watched them go until the dust settled like a curtain. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt the way you do after pushing a boulder off your porch. Relief, and the knowledge there's always another on the ridge. "Warning given," he said finally, voice even. "That's how we keep our land." Tanner climbed down, boots thudding against the ladder rungs. Up close, his hand trembled a little where he'd braced the rifle. Chad put a steadying palm on his shoulder. "Good shot," he said. "That one counted," Tanner said. "They'll test us again." "They'll think twice," Chad answered, "until someone else thinks they can take what's ours." Jacob came down and slid a small packet into Chad's palm, a scrap of cloth with something written on it in careful letters. "Found it where they were standing," he said. "Marked not for us." Chad unfolded it with slow fingers and read the single line: "Move in 2 nights. Riverside. Bring wood." He folded the paper back up and tucked it into his pocket. The farm wanted peace. The world wanted what it had. They would have to be harder than either. Betty watched the three of them from the porch, face set like stone. At her side, Jack clapped a hand on her shoulder and squeezed once. "We'll keep this place," he said quietly. "We're Thornburghs. We don't give up fields." And Chad, feeling the weight of that truth like a tool in his hand, looked at the silo where Tanner had stood and thought about the watchtower's holes in the concrete, the warm rooms in the log house, the secret door under the floor that led to the cellar. He thought about the girl his mother had mentioned, someone to stitch and steady, and how the farm might need more than men and fences before it could be truly safe. The warning had worked, for now. But the paper in his pocket told him another truth. The quiet was not a promise. It was a pause, and somebody out there was planning to use it. Chapter 8. 8. A stranger at the fence. The first real warmth of spring came with a cold wind trailing behind it, that false promise the season always gives before the last frost. The ground had softened enough to work, and Tanner was patching the east fence while Chad and Jacob checked the stream traps. Betty was hanging wash by the garden when she spotted the figure walking up the lane. "Chad!" she called. He looked up from the stream bed and saw her. A lone woman moving slow but steady, backpack slung over one shoulder, coat faded to gray. Her hair caught the sunlight like pale straw, and her steps carried the careful weight of someone who'd walked too far. Chad's hand went instinctively to his sidearm. "Stay sharp," he told Tanner. As the woman drew closer, she raised both hands, palms out. "I'm not here to steal or beg," she said, her voice carrying clear over the wind. "Name's Claire. Claire Danning. I came from St. Charles." Betty reached the fence first, eyes narrowing against the sun. That's near 50 miles east. You walk that far?" "Not all at once," Claire said, smiling faintly. "Caught a ride here and there when it was safe. Heard about a farm out this way that still had folks worth knowing. Tanner's rifle stayed lowered but ready. And how'd you hear that?" "From a man at a river camp. Said a family out here helped him and didn't shoot first." Betty looked back toward her son. "Well, sounds like our reputation's getting around." Chad stepped forward, expression unreadable. "You said you're from St. Charles. What kind of work did you do there?" "Nurse," she said. "Hospital on 5th Street, until it fell apart. Been patching folks up ever since. For food, mostly. I don't take charity." He studied her quietly. She was small, maybe 100 pounds soaking wet, hair tied back, glasses cracked on one side but holding. A faint scrape marked her cheek, old but healing clean. She stood straight, not scared but not foolish either. "What are you looking for here?" he asked. "Rest," she said. "A roof that doesn't leak and people who mean what they say. I can pull my weight." Chad hesitated. Tanner's eyes flicked to his. Jacob stood off near the porch, curiosity plain on his face. Betty broke the silence first. "You got a nurse standing in front of you, son. You gonna leave her on the road to get herself killed?" Claire gave a small shrug. "Wouldn't be the first time somebody turned me away." Chad sighed, rubbed the back of his neck, and unlatched the gate. "You can stay the night. We'll see about after." Claire nodded once, relief hidden behind steady eyes. "That's fair." That evening, she sat with them around the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. Betty asked her questions while the boys listened. Claire told them about the hospitals that had gone dark, the city blockades, the cholera that followed the floods. Her voice stayed calm, like she'd learned to talk about horror the same way she'd talk about weather. When she finished, Betty stood and put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You'll stay here a while," she said firmly. "This place could use a healer." Chad looked like he wanted to argue but didn't. After supper, he found himself standing by the porch rail again, same spot as before. The night was soft, full of frogs and the sound of the wind in the grass. Claire stepped out beside him, arms folded tight against the chill. "You built something strong here," she said. "Strong ain't always safe," he replied. "No," she said, glancing up at the watchtower. "But it's a start." He didn't know what to say, so he nodded once. When she turned to go back inside, Betty was standing in the doorway watching, that knowing half smile on her face. Tanner caught her look and whispered to Jacob, "Here we go." Jacob smirked. "About time." Chad just shook his head and went back to watching the dark horizon, pretending he hadn't heard a word. After supper, the lantern burned low. Everyone lingered at the table, half from curiosity, half from the comfort of having someone new under the roof. Betty poured more coffee. Tanner sharpened his knife on a stone, and Jacob listened like a sponge. Chad sat across from Claire, elbows on the table, voice quiet but steady. "You said you came from St. Charles," he began. "How bad is it out there?" Claire hesitated. "Bad," she said softly. "Worse than you think. The radio stopped giving truth months ago, after the power grids went down. The last military signals I heard said we'd been hit." "Hit?" Tanner asked. She nodded, pushing her glasses up her nose. "Not just one strike. Coordinated. Russia first. Electronic warfare, satellites taken out. Then China came in from the Pacific. EMPs. Cyber hits. Then boots on the West Coast." By the time anyone believed it, half the communications grid was gone. D.C. never recovered. The room went still. The only sound was the fire crackling in the stove. Jacob leaned forward. "You're saying we lost?" Claire looked at him, then at Chad. "I'm saying there's no country left to lose. There are pockets. Ex-military, civilians trying to rebuild, but no flag, no government. The old borders don't mean anything now. What's left is what you can hold." Betty's face had gone pale. "Lord have mercy." Tanner stared at the table, jaw tight. "And here we've been, building fences like it was just looters." "It's more than looters," Claire said. "There are organized groups now. Some call themselves militias, others reclaimers. They take over land, towns, farms. The one near St. Charles flies an old flag, says they're the real America now." Chad didn't speak for a long moment. The weight of her words settled in deep. Everything he'd feared, everything he'd been preparing for. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was here. Finally, he said, "Then this farm isn't just home anymore, it's a line." Claire met his eyes. "If you can hold it, it'll matter. People will come. They already are." He nodded slowly. "Then we better be ready for them." Chapter 9. Smoke on the River. Part 1. The river's warning. Spring had come full, green and loud. The fields were waking fast, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and sap. Birds had returned to the hedgerows, and the creek out back ran faster than it had all year. But something about that water bothered Chad. It moved strange, heavier, darker, carrying the memory of what it passed. Claire had been at the farm a few weeks by then. She'd found her rhythm among them, helping Betty tend the small garden, stitching torn hands, boiling bandages, and setting up a small shelf of scavenged medicine bottles by the window. Jacob shadowed her often, eager to learn, scribbling notes in a worn ledger he'd claimed as his field journal. Tanner liked her too, though he'd never admit it outright. "She's got backbone," he said one morning while repairing the chicken pen. "Ain't many folks could walk 50 miles and smile while talking about it." Chad grunted from where he was splitting wood. "She's tough. You have to still care about people these days." Claire stepped out onto the porch just then, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, a stethoscope looped around her neck like a reminder of the old world. "That pump by the barn still sputtering?" she asked. "Always," Chad said. "I can fix it." He raised an eyebrow. "You a nurse or a mechanic now?" She gave a faint smile. "Field hospitals don't wait on plumbers." Jacob followed her out, and together they worked the pump until clean water spilled again. Claire laughed softly as the mud splashed her boots. The sound carried across the yard, rare, honest, and something the farm hadn't heard in months. From the porch, Betty watched her son watching Claire. She leaned against the post and said, "You could do worse, you know." Chad frowned. "Didn't say I was doing anything. Didn't have to. I can see it from here." He didn't answer, just went back to stacking wood, though there was a faint grin hiding in his beard. That night, while the family sat by the fire, Claire unfolded a small battered map across the table. The corners were burnt, the writing smeared, but it was still legible. "I want to show you something," she said quietly. "This line here," she traced along the Missouri River, "used to be a checkpoint. Now it's a border. Not official, but real. The militia that took St. Charles controls everything east of it. They're moving west, taking farmland, fuel, livestock, anything they can use. I crossed just before they sealed it." Jacob leaned over the map, brow furrowed. "You mean they're coming this way?" Claire nodded. "They move slow, but steady. They build camps as they go. They call themselves the People's Guard, but they're not guarding anything. They're rounding folks up, no, making them work." Betty's hand went to her chest. "Good Lord." Tanner looked at his father. "So that's what Clyde's been tied up with." Chad nodded grimly. "Makes sense. He wasn't acting alone." Claire looked up, meeting Chad's eyes. "Once they reach the river crossing west of here, they'll start looking inland. You got a few weeks, maybe less." Chad sat back, rubbing his chin. "Then we do what we always do. We prepare and build." By dawn, the farm was alive with purpose again. Tanner and Jack checked ammunition and fuel. Jacob inventoried supplies. Betty cooked extra, muttering prayers under her breath. Claire organized the cellar, turning it from a shelter into a small clinic. Rows of jars filled with herbs and alcohol, bandages rolled tight. That afternoon, Chad and Claire stood together by the edge of the creek. Smoke drifted far off on the horizon, thin, gray, rising from somewhere near the river. Claire pointed to it. "That's not a campfire." "I know," Chad said quietly. They stood there a long time, saying nothing, just watching the smoke twist into the wind. The peace was ending. The river had carried the warning upstream, and now it was on their doorstep. Part 2, Claire's Test. The next morning brought more work than daylight. Jacob and Tanner were cutting deadfall along the south fence when the chain on the saw jumped. The blade kicked. Tanner jerked back just in time, but Jacob caught the recoil square on his forearm. Blood came fast. "Dad!" Tanner's shout cut through the yard. Chad was at the fence line in seconds, heart hammering. Jacob's sleeve was slick with red, his face pale but calm. Claire came running from the porch, medical bag already open. "Get him inside," she said. "Table now." Chad lifted his boy and carried him through the door. Claire moved with purpose, sterilizing, stitching, talking Jacob through each breath. Her voice never shook. When it was done, she bandaged him clean and leaned back only when she was sure the bleeding had stopped. "You'll keep the arm," she said, half a smile on her face. "But no chopping wood for a few days." Jacob tried to grin. "I'll manage." Chad stood watching her work, the way her small hand steadied even the roughest of wounds. Something in him eased for the first time in a long while. "You did good," he said quietly. "Doing my job," she replied, wiping her hands. "I just hate doing it in candlelight." That night, the house slept early. The storm clouds had passed east, leaving the air heavy and warm. Chad walked the fence line out of habit, lantern swinging low. The frogs were loud down by the creek. When he turned back toward the porch, he nearly ran into someone rounding the corner. "Sorry," Claire said, catching her breath. "Didn't see you." He steadied her by the shoulders. "You're fine. Shouldn't be out here alone this late." "I couldn't sleep," she said, still wired from earlier. "I keep replaying it. What could have gone wrong?" "You kept it from going wrong," he said. "That's what matters." They stood close in the dim light, the smell of rain still fresh in the dirt. For a long moment neither spoke. Then she looked up, meeting his eyes, and the world just went still. No words, no plan. Just a quiet pull, two people who'd been holding their breath for too long. He brushed a loose strand of hair from her face as he looked into her beautiful blue eyes, and she leaned in before he could think better of it. The kiss was simple, unhurried, full of the kind of truth you don't get to practice. When they stepped apart, the air between them felt different. Claire smiled faintly. "Sir, guess I should say thank you." "Sir?" Chad said, laughing slightly, and said, "For what?" "For giving me a place worth missing," she said. Chad watched her walk back toward the house, lantern light catching in her hair like a soft flame. For the first time in years, something inside him stirred awake. She wasn't just beautiful. She had this calm, steady way about her that brought a kind of peace he'd almost forgotten existed. Smart, kind, and willing to help without being asked. He felt a quiet smile rise from somewhere deep, one that reached places he thought had gone cold. Even after she'd gone inside, he stayed there in the still night, listening to the creek's gentle trickle and the steady beat of his own heart, feeling more alive than he had in a long time. Part 3: Gathering Storms. The next week came in heavy with rain. Every morning the fields steamed under low clouds, and every night the thunder rolled closer from the east. It wasn't just weather, it was the sound of change pressing toward them. Claire spent her days reorganizing supplies, labeling bottles, drying herbs over the stove. Tanner joked that she was turning the kitchen into a doctor's office, but Chad didn't mind. He'd seen her save Jacob's arm. That was proof enough. One morning she found Chad by the barn, repairing a cracked yoke. His shirt was soaked through from rain, sawdust sticking to his arms. "You ever rest?" she asked. He didn't look up. "When the world does." She shook her head and smiled, setting a cup of coffee down beside him. "Then I'll keep the pot full." He took it, their hands brushing just long enough to say what neither of them could. Then Chad whispered, "Claire." She turned, smiled, and ran straight into his arms. They held each other for what felt like 20 minutes before their lips met in a deep, lingering kiss. Hand in hand they wandered through the field, laughing and sharing old stories beneath the bright and sunny sky. From the barn window, Betty watched with a smile stretching ear to ear, tears of joy shining in her eyes. Jack chuckled beside her and said softly, "I think the boy's found his heart." That afternoon, Tanner came running from the watchtower. "Smoke again. 2 plumes, near the river crossing." Chad was on his feet instantly. He climbed to the silo's upper platform with Tanner and Jacob right behind him. Through the binoculars, he saw it, thick black smoke twisting above the trees, too heavy for campfire. "Could be a town burning," Jacob said quietly. "Could be a convoy clearing ground," Tanner muttered. Chad lowered the binoculars. "Either way, they're close." Claire joined them moments later, breath short from the climb. "You think it's the militia?" "I'd bet my hammer on it," Chad said. "We've got 2 choices, dig in or disappear." Betty's voice came up from below. "You're not running, Chad Thornburgh. Not from anyone." He looked down at her and nodded once. "Didn't say I was." They doubled patrols that night. Tanner took the tower, Jacob the creek. Chad made rounds between them, rain slicking his beard, rifle slung over his shoulder. Inside, Claire sat at the table, writing in a small notebook. Supplies, rations, injuries. She was the kind of calm that made chaos stumble. Near midnight, the dogs started barking. Chad was out the door before the echo faded. Tanner called down from the silo, "Movement! East fence! Just one this time." Chad moved toward the light of the lanterns, rifle raised. The figure stopped short of the gate and shouted through the rain, "Don't shoot! I'm unarmed." He was young, barely 20, with a torn jacket and mud to his knees. "They're coming," he gasped. "A whole unit, 30, maybe 40 men, burning everything behind them. They'll be here by sunrise. Chad's fears are realized. Where'd you come from? River camp, the boy said. They hit us at dawn. Said we were hoarding food. I barely got out. Chad motioned to Tanner. Get him inside. Then to Claire, see what you can do for him. If he's lying, we'll know soon enough. She nodded and led the boy into the house, her voice steady, gentle. When Chad came in later, she looked up from cleaning a gash on the boy's arm. He's telling the truth. I saw their mark, the militia from St. Charles. Chad's racked his shotgun. Then tomorrow's the day. Claire met his eyes, her expression fierce but calm. You can't face 40 men alone. Don't plan to, he said. I've got a family. That night, while the rain hammered the roof, the Thornburghs prepared. Ammunition checked, rations divided, escape routes mapped. Jacob sealed the cellar door beneath the log house, camouflaging it with old planks. Claire packed medical kits and laid out lanterns. When she paused, Chad caught her looking at him. What? He asked. She shook her head softly. You just don't flinch, do you? He gave a faint smile. Learned a long time ago it doesn't change the outcome. Still, she said, voice quiet, it's something. The wind rattled the windows. Outside, lightning flashed, turning the farm silver for a heartbeat. Chad looked toward it. Tomorrow, he said, we hold this line. Part 4. The siege begins. They woke to a sky that was too bright for comfort, thin haze on the horizon, the kind of light that made everything look washed out and unreal. The farm smelled of wet earth and wood smoke and a tension so thick you could taste it. They painted signs by the main road and at the lane, plain boards, black letters. Chad wrote the words himself, steady and blunt. Thornburgh land. Ride past, live, step across. It will be your last step. Chad moved like someone who'd rehearsed his whole life for this moment. Slow, precise, without wasted motion. He checked the rifle one last time, felt the stock settle against his shoulder. Around him, the family moved into position like a single machine. Well-oiled, dangerous if anyone tried to break it. Tanner, silo, Chad said, eyes high. Call anything you see. Aim small, miss small. Tanner gave a curt nod and began climbing the ladder. He wore his father's old hat and had a blanket over his shoulders for the cold. In the silo, he would be both lookout and long-range deterrent, the farm's first and last line of sight. From up there, he could watch a man's shoulders move 2 fields away and make a choice before the man even knew he'd been seen. Jack took the east post, where the brush gave a cover, and a long sight line toward the creek. He had an old hunting rifle he kept oiled like a relic. His hands were steady, practiced from years before the blackout. Betty stood beside the porch with a shotgun. She'd learned how to use it in a week because she'd never let anyone tell her she couldn't. Claire had a carbine slung over her shoulder, holster low, medical bag within reach. Jacob, still bandaged but stubborn as always, would watch the gate with a pistol and a wired remote to set off some black powder charges he had made, then set in satchel of spare cartridges. They hadn't yet put words to the thing Chad felt in his throat. If it came down to it, they might have to shoot to keep the farm. At first light, dust bloomed over the road like a bad omen. It moved slow, deliberate. About 40 men in ragged uniforms, rifles slung, flags tattered and puffed with the dry wind. They came under the banner of the People's Guard, faces set in the hard lines of men who believed the law came from whoever could throw the loudest voice. A mounted officer, cleaner than the others, the one who looked like he'd been groomed in the old days, rode up to the fence and raised a hand. A bullhorn crackled to life in his palm. "Thornburgh property," he called. "This is the People's Guard. Lay down arms, hand over food and tools, and no one gets hurt. We'll take what's needed for the good of the region." Betty stepped forward, with the shotgun across her arms, so the barrel pointed to the sky, but not to the man. Her voice didn't wobble. "Ain't handing nothing over." The mounted man's face tightened. "We don't want to make this ugly, ma'am. You understand there are rules." Chad pulled the lantern higher, keeping the light tight to the porch. He stepped into view. His height, his beard, the way his hands hung ready, all spoke. "We're not giving up what keeps us alive," he said. "You want it? You come and take it." There was a chuckle from the guard ranks, a sound that didn't reach their eyes. The officer barked an order. Men fanned out, some toward the barn, others toward the house, testing the lines. From the silo, Tanner's voice came soft and controlled through the field. "Heads up. Movement at the east hedge. 3 men trying to skirt in." His breathing was steady, the silence of someone who'd learned not to rush a shot. Chad sent Jack a look. The older man eased backward into the shadows and took a bead. The intruders stepped into a clearing. One reached down to pick up what looked like a coil of wire. It might have been a trap. It might have been a provocation. Tanner whistled low. One sharp report split daylight. Precise, exact. The wire the man had been reaching for snapped and spun into the air. The man let out a curse and dropped back, clutching the ruined piece of equipment. Tanner's shot had been deliberate. Damaging gear, not man. A warning, but a practical one. The guard froze. Chad called out, voice flat and loud enough, "We're not your storage unit. Leave now. You take one of ours, you'll be costing yourselves more than you gain." He did not beg. He didn't try to bargain. He said the only thing men in his position could. The farm was a line, and lines would be defended. The mounted officer barked back into the megaphone. "One more act of defiance, and we come in full. You will answer for it." Tanner's next order echoed cool as winter. "Keep your heads low and your hands where I can see them." He held the sight for a count that felt like forever, then relaxed. He would not fire, unless the shadow moved like a threat. And then the real test came. A small group of guard men, bolder, younger, moved closer, stepping quick to exploit distraction. One of them crouched at the gate and began to work a lockpick. His partner scanned this way and that, not seeing the boy's hands the way Jacob's fingers flexed on a pistol just inches from a hinge. Then Jacob pressed his first black powder charge, a deafening loud boom. Then all 3 men flew 15 feet in the air with a cloud of dust twice as high. Claire moved like she had to, fast and careful. She stepped out, hand open in plain gesture, and called his name. Stolen tactic from 100 ward rounds where calling a name once could stop panic. "Sir," she called out clearly, "you don't have to do this. Look at what you're doing. You've already injured 6 of your men. That's if they all live. Think of this. Odds are 20 more of you will die before you make it in that gate that's right. Look to your right and left. Half of you will be dead in the next 5 minutes if you come closer. Trust me, that was not even close to the only powder charge. Here we have hundreds. And what will your kids say when their dad don't come home tonight?" It was part plea, part professional assessment, knowing how to get people to stop. The man flinched, more surprised than sorry. Claire didn't lower her guard. She kept moving, got the gate between them, and set the safety on him with the authority of someone used to saving lives and often needing to say no in the same breath. The guard murmured. Their leader's face went red with impatience. He raised the bullhorn again. "You have 10 seconds." Chad took one step forward, measuring the sound of his voice like a tool. "Go home," he said. "Forget this road. You'll have the land you got left, and we'll have the land we've kept. We won't be part of your list." "What if we don't leave?" the officer asked. Then the sky filled with a crack. Tanner's second shot, placed to center of the bullhorn as the officer lowers it from speaking. The sound of a bullet pinging the horn. The officer flinched. Men ducked instinctively. The mounted man's face went hard. "Last chance," Chad said. "Back up and don't come again." He could have given an ultimatum the way the officer had, but he sensed something else. Fear in the other's orders. The crack of equipment that wasn't battle-hardened. For a long, tense minute, nothing moved. Then, slowly, the guard began to pull back. Not because one man had said so, but because they understood the cost. They'd come to take what they could, and the Thornburghs had shown they intended to make every inch a fight. When the last figure disappeared beyond the trees, the family exhaled. The air trembled with the echo of gunshots and adrenaline. Inside, Claire moved quietly through the rooms, checking faces, setting out hot drinks, wrapping hands in clean cloth. Jack stood at the door in the chill light and simply said, "Nobody hurt?" His voice was small. It had to be. They'd all seen what hurt looked like. "No," Claire replied. "No one hit. We did well." Her fingers were steady, collarbone tight with something that might have been relief. Chad leaned against the doorframe, the weight of the moment settling into his bones like winter into old wood. He knew this was only a pause. The guard would test again. Some would come back with someone intent on forcing a hand. But for the moment his boys were safe, his mother stood at his side, and a woman who'd walked from St. Charles had chosen this place. He stepped out under the silo and looked up at Tanner. Thin shadow cut against the daylight. "Good work," he called. Tanner's reply was a soft, tired milestone. "We held the line." Chad let the words sit. Holding the line meant more than guns and holes in concrete. It meant knowing what you were willing to lose and what you would kill to save. He had never wanted to be a soldier. He had wanted to be a carpenter. But a carpenter protects his home the same way a soldier guards a post, by making sure it stands and that the people inside can live. That night they sat close and spoke little. Then Chad broke the silence. "Hey, everyone. I'm damn proud of you all. Mom, Jack, thank you. Tanner, you're becoming the man I always knew you would be. I couldn't be prouder. Jacob, you're turning into a fine young man yourself. You amaze me with how smart you are and the things you build. And Claire, thank you for being here for us." Everyone thanked Chad in their own way. Claire sat nearest to him, her hand finding his for a moment. A quiet gesture that said what words couldn't. The farm had been tested and it hadn't cracked. Outside, the fields smelled of wet earth and something older, promise or warning. Chad slept in the loft that night and dreamed of nails and timbers and a place where a man could teach his boys to build a life that was more than holding on. In the morning, the radio hissed a warning none of them wanted to hear. Convoys moving inland, new flags, old maps redrawn by the hungry. But the Thornburgh farm had a watchtower now, a log house, a hidden cellar, and a woman who could stitch a man as well as quiet a temper. The line was drawn, and they were ready to sharpen it. Chapter 10. Lines of Trust. Part 1. After the Siege. The first morning after the siege came in gray and heavy, a kind of silence that didn't belong to peace so much as exhaustion. The smoke from the guards' camp still clung to the horizon, thin and bitter. Crows circled the edge of the fields, where the wind carried the smell of burnt soil. Chad stood in the yard before sunrise, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, eyes on the horizon. The land looked bruised. The fence line had taken damage, posts splintered, wire sagging where rounds had cut through. The smell of oil, gunpowder, and rain hung low over the farm. He'd been through storms before, real ones with thunder and wind that tried to tear roofs off houses, but nothing like this. This storm left the ground quiet. This one left ghosts. Behind him, the farmhouse door creaked open. Claire stepped out, hair loose, wearing one of Betty's old sweaters. "You didn't sleep," she said softly. He shook his head. "Wasn't much point." She came up beside him, slipping her arm around his. "You kept us safe." Chad stared out toward the tree line. "Safe's a word I don't trust anymore." She didn't argue. She just stood with him until the cold started to creep up her bare arms. By mid-morning, the family had fallen into motion. Tanner and Jack walked the perimeter, checking the traps and alarms Jacob had designed. Some had been triggered during the night, false alarms mostly, where the wind set off cans or loosened brush. But each sound had served its purpose. It made the enemy nervous. Jacob sat at the kitchen table, soldering a wire from a broken radio into a new alarm switch. "If I can get the receiver working," he said, "we'll have early warning next time." "There won't be a next time," Betty said from the stove, though her voice carried more hope than conviction. "Not if those men have half a brain." Claire glanced up from where she was wrapping bandages. "Hope you're right, ma'am. But in my experience, men with guns and hunger rarely think straight." Chad came in then, hands still dirty from fixing the fence. "She's right. We'll keep the watch doubled for a while." He looked around the room at each of them, his mother, his stepfather, his sons, and Claire. The people he'd managed to keep breathing another day. "We got through it," he said quietly. "Now we start fixing what they broke. I want a log fence, 10 foot high with pointed ends, all the way around the property. Then we set Jacob's traps on the outside and run a second plain wire fence 5 feet inside that. Jacob, I want your powder charges placed between the fence rows. That way we don't accidentally set one off and we get a line of defense like nowhere else. And as we get time, let's make the cellar deeper, with extra exits to the south and northeast." He let the plan hang in the air, steady and practical, the kind of talk that made people feel safer just hearing it. By evening, the yard was alive with the sound of hammers and saws. Tanner and Jacob rebuilt the gate, driving new posts into the soft ground. Jack worked along the east fence, whistling under his breath. Betty carried warm food out to them all, cornbread, stew, coffee that tasted faintly of smoke. When the day finally gave out and the lanterns came on, the family sat on the porch together, shoulders brushing, quiet but not defeated. Claire leaned against the railing, looking up at the stars starting to show through the haze. "You ever think we might see the world normal again?" she asked. Chad thought about it. "Not like it was," he said, "but maybe something worth living in." Betty smiled faintly. "That's as close to optimism as we'll get out of him." Claire laughed, and for a moment the air around them lightened. Part 2. the proposal. The days after the siege passed like slow rain. Work filled the daylight, and silence filled the rest. But that night, that one evening when the farm finally smelled of peace instead of smoke, felt different. Dinner was quiet but comfortable. Betty had made roast and potatoes, the kind of meal they used to save for holidays. Claire sat beside Chad at the table, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, laughing softly as Jacob told a story about rigging one of his trip alarms wrong and nearly catching himself. Tanner joked that he was lucky he didn't blow off his boots. Even Jack smiled, a small, tired grin that made the lamplight seem warmer. When the plates were cleared, nobody moved to leave. The night air drifted through the windows, carrying the smell of honeysuckle and fresh-cut wood. Out on the porch, the stars were bright for the first time in months. Chad looked around at all of them, his family, his reason for everything, and then at Claire. Something in him said it was time. He cleared his throat, stood, and rubbed the back of his neck. "Y'all come on out for a bit," he said. "Got something I need to say." Betty's brow lifted, but she followed him out, the others right behind. They gathered on the porch, the boards creaking under their boots. The lantern light painted soft gold over everyone's faces. Chad turned to Claire. His hands were rough and scarred, but steady. "Claire," he said, "you came here when the world was at its worst. You didn't owe us a thing, but you stayed anyway. You saved my boy. You patched us up. You gave this place a little peace." She tried to smile, but her lip trembled. "You don't have to thank me, Chad." He shook his head slowly. "Ain't about thanks. It's about what's right." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box, handmade, worn smooth from years of being carried. "I was saving this," he said quietly. "Never knew if I'd see another good day. Guess tonight's close enough." The porch went still. Tanner's eyes widened. Betty's hand covered her mouth. Chad dropped to one knee. Not polished, not rehearsed. Just a man doing what his heart told him to. He opened the box. Inside was a small diamond ring, a little rough, but it caught the lantern light like a star. "Claire Danning," he said, voice low and steady, "will you marry me?" Claire's breath caught. For a second, the world around them, the crickets, the wind, the long ache of months past, just fell away. She blinked back tears, smiling through them. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, with a laugh that cracked but didn't break. "Yes, I will." Betty wiped her eyes. Tanner let out a whoop that echoed down the fields. Jacob grinned so wide his glasses nearly slid off. Jack raised his cup of whiskey. "About damn time," he said. Chad stood, slipped the ring onto her finger, and kissed her. Soft, simple, and sure. Claire leaned into him, hands on his chest, tears glistening like dew. For the first time in a long while there was joy on that porch. Real, clean joy. Laughter rolled through the night like music, and even the stars seemed to burn a little brighter. Part 3. The Feast. By the third evening after the proposal, hope had begun to replace exhaustion. Betty decided they needed a celebration. "We've spent enough nights worrying," she said, planting her hands on the kitchen counter. "It's time we remember we're still alive." So they set to work. Tanner butchered a deer they'd smoked weeks before. Jack unearthed a dusty jar of molasses from the pantry. Claire kneaded bread dough while humming an old song that Betty half remembered from her own mother. Jacob fixed the generator long enough to run the old radio, and for the first time since the power went out, Music drifted across the Thornburgh farm. By sundown, lanterns hung from fence posts, their light flickering over tables set in the yard. The smell of venison stew and cornbread filled the air. It wasn't fancy. It was survival made beautiful for one night. Chad sat at the head of the table with Claire beside him, her new ring catching the firelight. He looked down the row at his people, his sons, his mother, Jack, the woman he loved, and felt something close to peace. When Betty raised her glass, her voice trembled just a little. "To Chad and Claire," she said, "to a home worth fighting for." Glasses clinked. Laughter rose. For the first time in a long while, the Thornburghs sounded like a family, not a fortress. Later that night, as the stars came out and the last of the cornbread disappeared, Jacob's new alarm line gave a faint jingle. Just one bell, distant but certain. Tanner and Chad were on their feet before the sound had even died. "Hold," Chad said, raising a hand. "Could be a deer." But then came a voice, faint, but calling through the dark. "Help, please!" They grabbed lanterns and rifles, moving cautiously toward the gate. Two figures stumbled out of the shadows, a young woman supporting an older man. The man's face was ashen, his clothes soaked through with blood and rain. The girl couldn't have been more than 20, eyes wide and terrified. "Please," she gasped. "He's hurt bad. We came from Moscow Mills. Raiders hit the town, burned everything." Chad's heart clenched. "Get them inside." Claire and Betty rushed forward, taking the old man's weight. His breathing was shallow, his skin gray. Claire's hands moved fast. Compressions, bandages, water. But she knew the look. He was too far gone. When the man passed before dawn, Claire closed his eyes and whispered a prayer. The girl, Emily, she said her name was, sat trembling beside the table, silent tears streaking her face. Tanner crouched beside her. "You're from Moscow Mills?" Tanner froze. "I know you," he said softly. "William R. Capel Elementary, right? You were in my class, Mrs. Miller's room." She nodded. "I knew you," she said quietly. "Yes, you were in my class." He blinked, trying to place her. And then he saw it. The same eyes, a little older, haunted now. "Emily?" She nodded again, crying harder. "I didn't know where else to go." He reached out, set a hand on her shoulder. "You're home now. You're safe." Behind them, Betty stood in the doorway, hand to her heart. Chad met her gaze, and she gave a slow nod. The family had just gotten bigger again. Part 4. A New Thornburgh. Emily slept most of the next day. When she finally woke, the house was quiet except for the sound of hammers outside, Chad and Tanner rebuilding a section of fence. She wandered to the doorway, watching them work. "Can I help?" she asked softly. Tanner turned, wiping sweat from his brow. "You ever set a post?" "No," she said. He handed her a shovel. "Good time to learn." By evening, she'd earned her share of blisters. Betty handed her a cup of cold water. "You work like you belong here," she said kindly. Emily smiled faintly. "Feels good to belong somewhere." That night, the family gathered around the porch again. The air was warm, the moon low and orange over the horizon. Claire sat beside Chad, her head resting on his shoulder, the diamond on her hand glinting softly in the lantern light. Tanner and Emily sat a few steps down, laughing quietly at something Jacob said about his booby traps and how he almost caught a raccoon instead of a thief. Betty leaned back in her chair, hands folded. "It's starting to look like a home again," she said. Chad looked around at the faces, his sons, his mother, Jack, Claire, and now Emily. He nodded. "It is home, and it's staying that way." Jack raised his glass of shine. "To holding what's ours." They drank to that, to family, to love, to hard days and small mercies. For that one night, under the Missouri stars, the Thornburgh farm was something rare, peaceful, and if tomorrow brought trouble, they'd face it together. Because that's what Thornburghs did. They built, they fought, they endured. Chapter 11. New Blood, Part 1. First light spring came late that year, slow and shy after months of cold and gray. The fields thawed in patches, brown grass giving way to hints of green. The farm breathed again, though the air still carried the memory of smoke. Emily was the first up most mornings. She'd step out into the dew and mist, her boots sinking into soft mud as she crossed to the barn. Tanner met her there, always with a half grin and a mug of coffee. "Careful," he'd say. "That goat'll head-butt you if you look at her cross-eyed." She'd laugh, her hair falling in her face, and together they'd fall into rhythm, feeding animals, mending fences, fixing the broken latch on the chicken coop. She wasn't used to this kind of work, but she learned fast. She had grit, and Chad respected that. One morning, watching from the porch, Chad said to Claire, "That girl's got the same stubborn streak you had when you showed up here." Claire smiled. "Guess she's in the right place, then." Inside, Betty cooked breakfast while Jacob fiddled with the radio. Static mostly, but every now and then a voice slipped through, talking about settlements out west. The world, it seemed, was trying to rebuild itself. Chad wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a dangerous one. Part 2. When the rains came by late March, the rain started and didn't stop. Day after day, the sky opened up, and the world turned to water. The Quiver River rose out of its banks and crawled across the fields, swallowing fence lines and trees. The family worked in shifts, digging trenches, lifting supplies to the barn loft, praying the hilltop would hold. Nights were spent around the stove, listening to the roar outside, the steady drumming on the roof that drowned out thought. Jacob patched leaks with tar and cloth. Tanner built sandbag barriers by the old road. Emily stayed close, helping wherever she could, soaked through but smiling. "You folks ever get a dry spring?" she joked one night, wringing out her shirt. Chad chuckled. "Not in Missouri." By the third week, even the rain seemed to get tired. The clouds thinned, leaving behind a world washed clean and raw. But the river, that wild Missouri water, wasn't done yet. Part 3. The White Ford. It was a Tuesday morning when the sound of an engine rolled up the hill. Not thunder, something steadier, older. Tanner and Chad stepped out onto the porch, rifles slung just in case. Through the mist came an old white Ford flatbed, mud-caked halfway up its tires. The engine coughed once and went quiet. The driver's door opened, and Tanner froze. "Lucas?" he said, disbelief breaking into a grin. Lucas Hall, his cousin from down on the Quiver, stepped out. He stood nearly 7 foot tall, wore beard grown wild, boots heavy with river mud. His wife, Madeline, climbed out after him, one hand resting protectively over the swell of her belly. "Storm got us bad," Lucas said, voice hoarse. "River came higher than I've ever seen. Lost the barn, the house, everything. Figured I'd bring her somewhere dry." Chad clasped his hand tight. "You're home here as long as you need it." They stayed through the spring. Lucas had brought some broken solar panels he'd found along the road for Jacob to tinker with, and he did. Before long, he had them charging an old car battery, and for the first time in months, They had working lights for a few hours each night. Lucas was a great help, working side by side with Tanner and Chad, hauling lumber and replacing what the floods had taken. Madeline spent her days in the kitchen with Betty, Claire, and Emily. Her laughter soft and gentle, like sunlight breaking through clouds. When the rain finally gave up for good and the river slid back into its bed, the farm shone green again. For the first time in a long while, life felt possible. Lucas stood in the drive one morning, packing tools into the Ford. Tanner frowned. "You sure you're heading back? You got a place here?" Lucas smiled faintly. "My home and heart are on the river. Always been. But now I know where y'all are if I need you. And if you need me, you know how to reach me." Chad nodded. "Roads open again?" Lucas grinned. "Getting better. Only took me 2 days to get here. Folks out there are talking, you know. Word spreading about the Thornburgh farm. They're calling it a fortress, a place that stood when others fell. You're becoming famous, whether you want to be or not." Chad smiled, shaking his head. "We just kept our ground." Lucas climbed in the truck. "That's what folks need to hear." When the Ford rolled away down the muddy road, Tanner watched until it disappeared into the trees. "Damn river's gonna swallow him one day," he muttered. Chad smiled. "Maybe, but that river made him who he is." Part 4. Homes on the Hill. That summer, the Thornburghs built like they'd never built before. Chad and Claire started on the big log house up on the rise, a proper home with thick oak walls, wide windows, and a porch that looked down over the fields. Claire wanted the kitchen to face east, so the morning sun would pour in when she baked. Chad made it so. Down by the old silo, Tanner and Emily built their own cabin. Smaller, but theirs. Jacob drew up plans and measured twice, proud of every straight cut. Jack oversaw from his chair with his whiskey and his stubborn old wisdom. Betty cooked for everyone, fussing that Tanner was too skinny, and Emily worked too hard. At night the place glowed, firelight in every window, hammers still echoing into the dark. Tanner played his guitar on the porch, singing low songs about rivers and roads. Emily sat beside him, her head on his shoulder. From up on the hill, Chad and Claire would listen, their hands intertwined. The smell of sawdust and summer air drifted up from the valley. "You ever think we'd make it this far?" Claire asked. Chad smiled. "Didn't think we'd get this lucky." She leaned into him. "This isn't luck, Chad. This is what happens when good folks hold their ground." He kissed her temple, watching the lanterns flicker below. "Then we'll keep holding it." For now, the world beyond their fences could wait. Inside them, life was finally growing again. Chapter 12. Flags and Family. Part 1. Ashes and Arrival. The afternoon sun hung low over the Missouri hills, thick with dust and silence. Not far from the barn, Chad was tightening a hinge on the smokehouse door when Claire called out from the porch, her voice cutting through the stillness. "Chad, someone's coming up the road." He straightened, wiping sweat from his brow, eyes narrowing against the glare. Down the gravel lane, a figure moved slow but steady, a young woman, thin and tired, her dress torn and gray with soot. She carried a small satchel clutched tight to her chest. When she finally reached the yard, she stopped short, breathing hard. "Name's Sarah," she said, voice hoarse but steady. "From Silex. Raiders came 2 nights back. I was the only one to make it out." Claire stepped forward before Chad could speak, her face softening. "Come inside, honey. You're safe here." Betty was already at the door, waving her in. "You look half-starved, child." Inside, the smell of cornbread and soap hung in the air. Sarah set her satchel on the table. Inside were 3 worn books, a folded Bible, and a single photograph tucked in between the pages. She sat quietly as Betty ladled soup into a bowl, her hands trembling from exhaustion. Jacob lingered by the stove, pretending to adjust the fire. He kept stealing glances, drawn to the faint smile that flickered through Sarah's fatigue. When she caught him looking, she smiled back, small, tired, but real. By the time she finished her meal, the house had gone quiet. Outside, the wind rustled the corn, and the sun slipped behind the trees. Chad watched her for a moment and said simply, "You can stay here for a while. Rest. We'll figure the rest out later." For the first time that day, Sarah looked like she might cry. Not from fear, but from relief. Part 2. New Roots. Sarah didn't stay idle for long. Within a week, she was outside every morning helping Claire with the garden, sweeping porches, and gathering eggs. But she wasn't built for farm work. Her mind wandered elsewhere. One morning after breakfast, she found Chad in the barn sharpening an axe. "Mr. Thornburgh," she began carefully, "I'd like to build a schoolhouse. For the children, and maybe for the grown folk too." Chad raised an eyebrow. "A schoolhouse?" She nodded. "There's more to rebuild than fences. Folks need to remember how to hope again, and how to read that hope when they see it written down." Chad looked at her, measuring her words. Claire stood in the doorway, arms folded with that look that meant don't argue. Betty chimed in from behind her. "You heard the girl. We need more than hammers and nails to rebuild this world." So it was settled. They picked a small patch of flat ground just east of the silo. Tanner and Jacob cut the posts while Chad milled the beams. Claire painted a rough sign that read, "Thornburgh Schoolhouse. Learning for all." By late June, the sound of hammering and laughter filled the valley. Sarah directed the building like a general. Sleeves rolled, hair tied back, her voice crisp and sure. Jacob hovered near, pretending to fix windows or measure the same plank twice. When the roof finally went up, they stood back and looked at it, simple, straight, and strong. Sarah smiled, wiping dust from her cheek. "It's not much," she said, "but it's a start." By summer's end, families from miles around came with their children, trading seed, grain, or help for a chance to learn. Sarah's voice carried through the open windows, reading from her Bible or teaching history. And sometimes, when the work was done, she'd sing an old hymn that made even the crows go quiet. Jacob would linger at the door every evening, tools in hand, pretending he wasn't listening. Part 3. The Delegation. One evening, just as the sun sank red over the hills, a small convoy rolled up the lane, 3 wagons and half a dozen riders. The sound of horses and boots brought everyone out to the yard. A man with a preacher's collar stepped forward. "Mr. Thornburgh, my name's Hale. We've come from Montgomery County. There's talk of a council, a way to bring order back to this state. We want you to represent our township." Chad listened, arms crossed, while they spoke of trade routes, border patrols, and rebuilding local law. When they were done, he shook his head. "I appreciate the offer," he said evenly, but I don't wear another man's flag. My job's here, keeping this family standing." The preacher nodded respectfully. "Sir, with all due respect, maybe that's why you're the right man for it." After they left, Claire found Chad sitting on the porch, sharpening a chisel. The night was still, save for frogs down by the creek. "You're thinking about it," she said. Chad grunted. "I'm thinking how fast good intentions turn into bad orders." Claire smiled faintly. "Then maybe they need someone who knows the difference." He didn't answer, but his jaw set in that way it always did when he was trying not to agree out loud. Part 4. The Dinner Decision. Dinner that night was quieter than usual. The glow from the schoolhouse windows flickered across the table, the smell of Betty's fresh bread hanging thick in the air. Claire finally spoke. "You've already been leading, Chad. You just didn't give it a title." Betty nodded. "Your granddaddy always said, 'A flag don't make the man, but a man can sure make a flag worth following.'" Emily smiled faintly. "If good men don't lead, bad ones will." Tanner leaned forward. "Dad, you built this farm from nothing. Maybe it's time to help others do the same." Jacob added quietly, "You told us once to protect what matters most. Maybe now that's more than just us." And then Sarah, her voice soft but certain, said, "People already look to you, Chad. You gave them something to believe in. Maybe that's the kind of flag that really matters." The words settled like dust in sunlight. Chad looked around at the faces that made this place what it was. Then he nodded slowly. "All right, we'll do it the Thornburgh way. No speeches, no politics, just work, honor, and family." Betty smiled proudly. Claire reached for his hand. Tanner raised his glass. "To family," he said. Then Tanner cleared his throat and stood. "And since we're celebrating," he turned toward Emily, grinning. "Emily, this world's gone to hell and back, but you've been my reason to rebuild. Will you marry me?" Emily's hands flew to her mouth, tears spilling over. "Yes, Tanner. 100 times yes." The table erupted. Laughter, hugs, Betty crying, Jack pounding the table and shouting, "'Bout damn time." Later that night, when the farm had gone quiet, Chad took one last walk. The air was cool, the fields lit by the moon. He passed the barn, the garden, and finally the little schoolhouse, its windows glowing gold. Inside, Jacob and Sarah sat side by side, reading under a lantern. She laughed softly at something he said, and he leaned in, unsure, nervous, and kissed her. Chad smiled, shook his head, and closed the door softly behind him. "That's my boy," he whispered to the night. He turned toward the porch lights of home, the sound of crickets rising all around. The world beyond their fences might still be broken, but here, under the Thornburgh roof, something new had taken root. Chapter 13. The New Republic of Missouri, Part 1. The Council Forms. By late autumn, the air carried a weight of hope and uncertainty. The land had changed. Fences mended, barns raised, smoke curling from chimneys where families had found their footing again. What had started as a scattered collection of survivors was beginning to look like a country finding its feet. The first real meeting was held in an old feed co-op outside of Hawk Point. The sign above the door still read Missouri Grain and Supply, though the G and R were missing. Inside, a long table had been cobbled together from barn boards, and men and women from across 5 counties sat elbow to elbow. When Chad walked in, the room fell quiet. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Folks knew what the Thornburgh name meant: steady hands, fairness, no games. A man from Montgomery County stood and said, "We're rebuilding something worth keeping. The new Republic of Missouri, under the United States of America, if she ever gets her legs again." Chad listened as they spoke about law, trade, roads, and protection. He didn't care much for titles, but he cared about order, about doing what was right. When it came time to speak, he stood slowly, hat in hand. "I ain't no politician," he said, "but I know this: a man's word still means something, and a community's only as strong as the folks willing to work for it. If you want me to help, I'll do it the Thornburgh way: honest, fair, no flag higher than family." There was a pause, then a slow murmur of agreement that grew into applause. The vote was unanimous. Chad Thornburgh, elected as one of the founding representatives of the new Republic of Missouri. By the time he rode home, the sunset painted the fields copper and gold. Claire waited on the porch, a lantern in her hand, smiling like she already knew. "Well?" she asked. Chad smiled faintly. "Guess I'm a politician now." She laughed softly. "Just promise me you'll still build more than you talk. That's the only kind of building I know." Part 2. The New Laws of the Land. The weeks that followed were restless ones. Word of the council spread faster than anyone expected. From Troy to Montgomery City, folks started calling it the Republic, half joking at first, then not at all. The name stuck. They held meetings every 2 weeks in the same feed co-op, lanterns swinging from hooks and paper maps nailed to the walls. The talk was plain and serious. Food stores, trade routes, river crossings, and what to do with troublemakers. There weren't many laws left to lean on, so they had to build their own. Chad spoke less than most, but when he did, people listened. "Paper laws don't mean much," he said one night. "If a man can't look his neighbor in the eye and keep his word, no government can fix that. But we can make sure folks have a fair say, a fair trade, and a fair warning before judgment." They agreed to simple rules: no stealing, no harm without cause, trade honest or don't trade at all. Each county keeps its own council, but the Republic speaks as one voice when it must. A man from Pike County asked, "And what happens when someone breaks those rules?" Chad answered without hesitation. "Then we remember what our grandparents did. We handle it face to face. Not cruel, not quick, but fair." The others nodded. In a world stripped of convenience and power, fairness had become the only real law left that mattered. Outside, after the meeting broke, Chad stood under the cold stars. He could see his breath, could feel the weight of what they were building. Claire walked up beside him, her shawl wrapped tight. "You think it'll hold?" she asked. He looked out over the fields, where the dark outline of the land met the night sky. "If people remember who they are," he said, "yeah, it'll hold." They stood there a long time, side by side, as the lanterns inside flickered and the new Republic of Missouri began to take root, not from power or law, but from the steady hands of those who refused to give up. Part 3. Trade and Tension. Winter came early that year. By December, frost painted every fence post white, and the mornings cracked with ice beneath the horses' hooves. The new Republic of Missouri had held steady through its first season, but peace in those times was fragile, like glass stretched too thin. The first cracks showed in trade. A small caravan from the west, 3 wagons and 6 armed men, rolled into Hawk Point one morning. They claimed to be traders from what was left of Columbia, bringing salt, kerosene, and medicine. Word spread fast, and soon the co-op yard was full of people eager to barter. But there was something off about the group. Their leader, a sharp-eyed man named Riker, carried himself more like a raider than a merchant. His men stood close to their wagons, hands never far from their rifles. Chad arrived mid-morning with Tanner and Lucas. He watched from the edge of the crowd, reading faces the way an old carpenter reads wood grain, looking for cracks before the split. When Riker noticed him, he grinned. "You the one they call Thornburgh? Heard you're the big voice around here." Chad didn't answer right away. "Ain't about voices," he said. "It's about fairness. You trading or you taking?" Riker chuckled. "That depends on what fairness means to you." The crowd quieted. Tanner's hand drifted toward his rifle, but Chad lifted a finger. Calm, measured. "Fair means both sides walk away alive," Chad said. "We'll deal straight. But you cross that line, and you won't like what you find on this side of the river." The standoff held for a long moment. Then Riker spat into the dirt and laughed. "You got grit, old man. Maybe we can work something out." For 3 days the trade went on, tense but civil. Jacob even managed to get a few old radio parts from one of Riker's men, hoping to build something that could reach beyond county lines. But on the 4th night, one of the wagons caught fire behind the co-op. A boy from Warren County ran out screaming, smoke curling from his clothes. The fire spread fast, licking up the old boards, sending sparks into the night sky. Men rushed with buckets, shouting orders, but by dawn, half the co-op was gone. The traders were gone too, along with most of the medicine and 2 of the Republic's horses. When the ashes cooled, Chad stood in the ruins, fists clenched at his sides. "We can rebuild a building," he said quietly, "but trust, that takes longer." The council met that night in what was left of the feed room, lanterns flickering low. Voices rose. Some wanted revenge, others called for reason. Claire sat near the back, her hands clasped tight, eyes on Chad. Finally he stood. "We'll hunt them down if we have to," he said. "But not for anger, not for pride. We do it to protect what's left of right." The room fell silent. The next morning, before the search party set out, Betty came to the barn with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a framed photo, one of Chad, Tanner, and Jacob from years before. The glass was cracked, the frame chipped, but the picture was still clear. She pressed it into his hands. "In case you forget what you're fighting for," she said. He swallowed hard, unable to speak. That night, under a sky thick with winter stars, the Thornburgh men rode east, 3 shadows against the snow, lantern light trailing behind them. They didn't know what waited out there, or if the Republic would survive its first wound. But as Chad looked over at his sons, he felt something stronger than fear, the kind of love and purpose that could outlast even the coldest war. Part 4. Blood and Brotherhood. The morning they rode out, frost glazed the windows of the farmhouse and the air bit like steel. Breath hung thick around the horses' muzzles as Chad, Tanner, Jacob, and Lucas Hall saddled up in silence. The world was white and still, too still, the kind of quiet that comes before hard choices. Lucas swung into the saddle like a man born in one. Nearly 7 feet tall, shoulders broad as a barn door, he looked like something carved from oak and muscle. His voice rumbled low when he spoke. "You sure about this, Chad?" Chad adjusted the rifle strap on his shoulder. "No, but I'm sure we can't let folks think they can burn us out and walk away." Lucas nodded once. "Then let's ride." They followed the old river, rode east, the horses' hooves crunching on frozen mud. The wind cut through their coats, but no one complained. Tanner rode a few yards ahead, sharp-eyed and steady. Jacob, smaller but focused, had his father's old pistol holstered at his side, hand never far from it. By noon, they'd found signs, tracks from wagon wheels and boot prints leading toward an abandoned sawmill outside Truxton. It was a place Chad knew well, the old property of his friend Matt LaRue, a man he hadn't seen in years but never forgotten. As they slowed near the tree line, a shadow shifted beside the mill and a low voice called out, "Chad!" Chad turned, rifle half raised, before a tall figure stepped into view, wrapped in a heavy coat, his beard thick with frost. "Matt LaRue," Chad said, relief breaking across his face. "Didn't think I'd ever see you here again." Matt grinned and stepped forward, gripping Chad in a rough hug. "Heard what happened back west," he said quietly. "Figured you'd come looking for my trespassers. They've been camping down on my land. I've set a few traps along the creek and got eyes on 'em. You just say the word, old friend, and I'm ready." Chad nodded. "We'll take it careful. They've got rifles and no conscience." Matt's eyes flicked toward the smoke rising beyond the ridge, a gray thread twisting into the cold sky. "That's their camp," he said. "You boys follow me. Let's finish this." The 5 men moved together through the brush, Chad, his sons, Lucas towering behind them, and Matt guiding the way like a ghost through his own woods. The air smelled of pine and gun oil, and every step forward carried the weight of memory and duty. When they reached the ridge, the camp came into view. 4 wagons, 3 fires burning, half a dozen men scattered around them, laughing loud and careless. The stolen horses were tied nearby, ribs showing through their winter coats. Chad scanned the scene and whispered, "We go in talking. If it turns bad, we end it fast." Lucas smirked, cracking his knuckles. "Talking first. Got it." Matt loaded a single shell into his old pump shotgun, eyes narrowing. "Don't worry, I'll save my voice for after." They stepped out of the trees and into the open. Riker spotted them first, his grin fading as his hand fell toward his belt. "Well, if it ain't the Republic boys," he said, voice sharp with mockery. "Come to trade again?" "Came for what you stole," Chad said, his tone flat and cold. "And for the boy you burned." Riker shrugged. "Wasn't me lit that fire. Accidents happen." Matt spat in the snow. "Ain't no accident setting camp on another man's land." The standoff stretched, the kind of silence that hums before thunder. Then one of Riker's men lifted his rifle. Tanner saw it first. "Down!" he shouted. The air exploded. Gunfire, shouting, smoke. Jacob dove behind. A wagon firing from cover. Lucas charged forward like a bull, swinging a broken axe handle and knocking one man clear off his feet. Tanner fired again, quick and precise. Matt's shotgun roared, echoing through the trees. He dropped 2 before they could reload, then ducked behind a stump, cursing under his breath. "Damn bastards picked the wrong patch of ground," he growled. Chad moved low and steady, his rifle kicking against his shoulder. One shot, then another. He wasn't shooting to kill, he was shooting to protect. But in times like these, He wasn't taking chances with his family and friends here. When the smoke began to clear, only Riker was left standing, blood streaking down his sleeve. He looked around at the bodies of his men, his face pale and shaking. "Don't," Chad warned as Riker's hand twitched toward his pistol. The man froze. Chad stepped closer, lowering his rifle. "You could have traded fair," he said. "You could have been part of something decent." Riker spat, trembling. "Ain't no decent left in this world." Matt stood beside Chad, shotgun still raised. "Then maybe it's time men like you stopped breathing it." But Chad shook his head. "No, let him crawl back and tell the others what he saw here, what the Republic stands for." Riker stumbled off into the snow, clutching his arm, leaving a red trail behind him. For a moment no one spoke. The air stung with powder and cold. Then Tanner broke the silence. "You think he'll come back?" Chad looked toward the horizon. "He might, but he won't find us sleeping." Matt laughed softly, shaking his head. "Same Thornburgh, I remember. Never lost your edge." Chad smiled faintly. "Never lost my friends, either." They gathered what was left. The stolen medicine, the horses, what supplies could be saved. Before leaving, Matt walked back to the sawmill, nailed a rough board over the door, and carved 3 words with his knife: land, honor, home. When he turned back, Chad was watching him. "You ever need a place?" Chad said. "You know where we are." Matt nodded, his eyes glinting. "Reckon I'll see you when spring breaks." The Thornburgh men and Lucas rode home slow that night, the stars bright and cold above them. None spoke much. Words weren't needed. They'd done what they had to, and maybe what was right. When the farmhouse lantern finally came into view, Claire stood waiting on the porch, her hair blowing in the wind. She saw them and ran forward, tears streaking her cheeks. Jacob dismounted first, and she pulled him into her arms. Tanner followed, weary but smiling. Chad swung down last, boots sinking into the frozen ground. Claire reached for his hand. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she whispered. Chad glanced back at the horizon, the faint glow of dawn rising over the hills. "Yeah," he said softly. "I found what's worth keeping." The men stood in the lantern glow, bruised, cold, alive, and behind them, the new Republic of Missouri stood a little stronger. Not because of laws or titles, but because of loyalty, friendship, and blood bound by something deeper than survival. Part 5. The Wedding. The next month brought a different kind of work, joy. The Thornburgh farm had seen its share of storms, gunfire, and loss, but now it would see a wedding. Claire's. And this time the whole county turned out to watch it happen. They cleared the north field, where the grass grew soft and high, the place where Chad once stood watch during harder days. Now it was peaceful, alive with color and laughter. Lanterns hung from fence posts and tree limbs, glass jars filled with wildflowers lined the path, and long tables were covered in red and white checkered cloths. Betty baked for 3 days straight, the air rich with the smell of bread and pie. Emily and Sarah gathered wildflowers from the creek beds until their arms overflowed with color. Jacob fixed up a small stage made from old barnwood, and Tanner strung wire and bulbs from post to post until the whole yard glowed like warm daylight. By noon, wagons and trucks rolled up from every direction. Cliff Kuntz and his wife Shiana were among the first to arrive, bringing a crate of homemade wine and a loud laugh that carried halfway across the field. J.C. showed not long after, dusted from the road and grinning like he never left, slapping Chad on the shoulder hard enough to make him stumble. "Wouldn't miss it, brother," he said. "Didn't think I'd ever see you clean up." Pastor Derek Miller from Silex came next, Bible under his arm, his voice warm and calm. "We've buried too many," he said softly to Betty. "Feels good to see someone get married for once." And then came Megan, Chad's half-sister, riding up beside her husband Christopher, both smiling wide. Megan climbed down and threw her arms around Chad, tears glinting in her eyes. "About damn time," she whispered. The crowd filled the field. Neighbors, farmers, carpenters, old faces from town, all there because they'd found something to live for again. When the hour came, the music quieted. Jacob tuned Tanner's old guitar, strumming a soft tune that rolled out across the fields like a prayer. Chad stood at the end of the aisle wearing a clean flannel, boots polished, and his grandfather's silver watch fob resting against his chest. His hands shook slightly, not from nerves, but from the weight of the moment. Then Claire stepped forward. Her dress was simple but beautiful, sewn from linen sheets stitched by Betty's hands, a strand of wild daisies woven into her hair. Every step she took felt like the world stitching itself back together. Jack stood before them, Bible in hand, his voice trembling as he began. "Love's not about easy times," he said. "It's about standing through the hard ones, shoulder to shoulder, when the world don't make sense. That's the kind of love that lasts." Claire went first. Her voice was steady, her eyes locked on Chad's. "I found hope again here," she said. "Not because the world gave it back to me, because you did." Chad took her hands, rough and scarred from years of work and war. "I don't know what tomorrow brings," he said quietly, "but I know who I want standing beside me when it gets here." The crowd stood silent, some smiling, some wiping tears. When Jack nodded, Chad leaned in and kissed her. Slow, certain, and real. The fields erupted in cheers. Tanner whooped loud enough to wake the hills. Jacob laughed and clapped. Betty cried openly, and Jack wiped his eyes and muttered, "About damn time." As the sun dipped low, the feast began. Cliff passed bottles of homemade wine down the tables. Megan and Shauna danced barefoot in the grass, laughing like schoolgirls. J.C. started singing while Tanner played guitar, and the rest joined him in a rowdy song that had half the men singing off-key. Even Pastor Miller smiled and tapped his foot along to the beat. Reminds him of his old days. Lucas held his baby girl high above his head, her giggles cutting through the music like silver bells. Madeline leaned against him, her eyes full of pride and peace. Later, when the sky turned dark and lanterns flickered like stars, Tanner began to play a softer song. His voice carried over the field, strong and sure. "We'll build what's broken. We'll plant what's lost. We'll keep the fire, no matter the cost." Chad pulled Claire close, their foreheads touching, the sound of laughter and crickets all around. They danced slow in the grass, her hand resting on his chest, where his heartbeat thudded steady and strong. For once, there was no fear in the night, just family, music, and the Missouri wind whispering through the trees. As the last song faded and the stars burned bright above, Chad held Claire tighter, his voice low against her ear. "You know, I think we just rebuilt something worth keeping." She smiled, eyes glistening in the lantern light. "What's that?" He grinned, quiet and certain. "Home." Chapter 14. Roots and Rust. Part 1. The wedding spring rolled in soft and warm, carrying the smell of honeysuckle and wet earth. The Thornburgh farm looked alive again, fences straight, the log homes finished and the silo standing proud with its new lookout built strong above it. For once, there wasn't the hum of tension in the air, just the sound of saws and laughter as the family prepared for Tanner and Emily's wedding. The build-up. The week before the ceremony was a whirlwind of sawdust, baking, and good-natured chaos. Jacob was in charge of hanging lanterns, which meant more swearing than progress at first. "You think these posts are level?" he called. Chad squinted. "They were, till you started climbing them." Tanner was trying to build the dance floor in the barnyard when the family dog decided to sprint across the freshly stained boards. Tiny, muddy paw prints trailed through the middle like a child's autograph. Tanner sighed, looking to his dad. "Think anyone will notice?" Chad grinned. "Son, they'll notice. But they'll know it's a Thornburgh job. Built with character." Even Betty couldn't keep a straight face when she came out to find flour all over the kitchen. And Jack, apron on, trying to pass as her assistant baker. "Jack, you've ruined my biscuits," he shrugged. "Can't ruin what you ain't tasted yet." "Then I'll make you eat every one of 'em," she said, laughing as she shooed him out. By the time the day finally came, everyone was tired but happy. The kind of tired that only comes from building something worth remembering. By noon, the road was lined with visitors. The first truck to roll up the lane was the old white Ford, Lucas behind the wheel, Madeline beside him, their baby girl asleep in her arms. Tanner ran to meet them, hugging Lucas hard enough to lift him off the ground. "Brought a whole crowd with me," Lucas laughed, waving back at the road. And sure enough, behind them came more familiar faces. Uncle Bobby and Aunt Crystal, Aunt Jessica, Aunt Danielle, and even Kinley, Tanner and Jacob's half-sister, who hadn't been seen in years. The reunion was like something out of another time. Hugs, tears, and laughter echoing across the fields. Betty couldn't stop smiling. "Feels like the whole clan finally found their way home," she said, wiping her eyes. They held the wedding near the silo, where the view stretched all the way to the tree line. Emily wore a light blue dress that fluttered in the breeze. Tanner stood waiting in a clean white shirt, his hands steady, but his heart racing. Jack officiated, his voice thick with pride. When he asked for vows, Tanner said, "We built this place out of what was left of the world. And out of that, I found you. You're my proof that good still grows." When they kissed, the crowd erupted. Claire clapped, Chad laughed, and Lucas whooped loud enough to startle the chickens. Betty cried harder than she had at her own wedding. That night they lit torches and played music until the stars came out. Tanner sang for Emily, his voice strong and full of joy. "Through fire and through flood, we found our way home. Through loss and through blood, we built our own." Jacob joined in on harmony, and for a while the farm sounded like peace itself. Laughter drifting through the fields, firelight dancing against the silo, and a new generation of Thornburghs beginning their story under a sky full of promise. Part 2. A New Life. A few months later, the spring fields turned green again, and the hum of life carried across the farm like an old familiar song. Tanner was mending the east fence that morning, shirt damp with sweat, when he heard Emily calling from the house. She was running across the yard, her hair loose in the wind, a folded handkerchief clutched tight in her hands. Her eyes were shining. "Tanner!" she called, breathless. "We're going to have a baby." For a second, he just stood there, the hammer slipping from his hand, landing in the dirt. The world went quiet around him. Then he laughed, that deep, boyish laugh that hadn't been heard in years. and pulled her into his arms, lifting her clean off the ground. "You serious?" he asked, half whisper, half disbelief. She nodded, tears mixing with her smile. "Dead serious." He held her for a long time, not saying a word, just listening to the sound of the wind in the trees, the place that had become their whole world. When they told the family, the kitchen erupted. Betty shouted, "Finally! Another Thornburgh!" Claire hugged Emily tight, laughing and crying all at once. Jack kissed her forehead, muttering something about God's good timing. And Chad, he didn't say a word. He just stood there with that quiet, proud smile that said more than words ever could. For weeks afterward, the house was alive with talk and plans. Emily sewed tiny clothes out of old linen, and Tanner built a cradle from walnut wood he'd saved since before the war. Jacob teased him, saying, "That thing'll outlast the barn." "Good," Tanner said. "So will my boy." The months rolled on, each one filled with more laughter and less fear. The farm grew, both in size and in spirit. Jacob and Sarah's schoolhouse filled with students, their laughter echoing through the valley. The fences stretched wider, strong and straight, and the storehouse brimmed with grain from fair trade and long workdays. By midsummer, life felt steady again, the kind of steady none of them had dared to dream about a few years back. Then came August, hot and heavy with cicadas singing in the trees. The day happened to be Chad's birthday, and before sunrise, the farmhouse was already stirring. Emily had gone into labor. Claire took charge without hesitation, her calm voice cutting through the flurry. Betty fetched towels, Sarah boiled water, and Tanner paced the porch until his boots wore grooves in the boards. Every time the screen door opened, his heart jumped, until finally, hours later, Claire stepped out, wiping her hands on a towel, that soft, knowing smile spreading across her face. "Tanner," she said, "come meet your son." He rushed in, dropped to his knees beside the bed, and stared at the tiny, perfect boy resting. In Emily's arms, the baby's fingers wrapped around one of his, and Tanner's voice caught. "We'll name him Chad," he said, "after the man who taught us what it means to stand our ground." The room went still. Chad Sr. stood in the doorway, his face unreadable for a moment, then softening into something deeper. He nodded once, swallowing hard, before leaning in to kiss Emily's forehead. "He's already got the Thornburgh look," he said quietly. "Strong, stubborn, perfect." That night, the family gathered on the porch again, all of them. Lucas and Madeline with their baby girl and his sister Kylie, Uncle Bobby and Aunt Crystal, Aunt Jessica, and Aunt Danielle laughing with Jack and Betty, Kinley sitting beside Jacob and Sarah, cousins Carly and Jersey passing the newborn between them with careful hands. The air smelled of honeysuckle and wood smoke, and the stars looked close enough to touch. The night hummed with that kind of peace that only comes after a long fight well won. Chad leaned against the porch railing, arms folded, watching his sons and their families. Generations standing together on the same Missouri dirt that had nearly been lost. Claire came up beside him, slipping her arm around his waist. "Look at them," she whispered. "That's what we were fighting for." Chad nodded slowly, eyes on the horizon. "Yeah," he said softly. "That's home." He turned toward the barn, pulled out his pocket knife, and carved 3 lines into the post by the door. "Built on faith, held by family, Thornburgh forever." The wind moved through the fields, bending the tall grass in slow waves. Somewhere beyond the tree line, thunder rumbled faintly. a reminder that the world never stopped changing. Chad looked out into the dark, the stars reflecting in his eyes, and smiled. "Let it come," he murmured. "We'll be ready." The farm, their home, stood unshaken beneath the stars. Echoes of tomorrow. The summer faded slow, the way Missouri summers do. Long evenings, quiet rains, and stars bright enough to feel close. The Thornburgh farm stood strong through it all, the fences weathered but unbroken, the land breathing steady again. Tanner and Emily's boy grew fast, and his cries were already part of the nightly music that carried across the valley. Every sound, the crickets, the creak of the barn, the laughter from the porch, seemed like proof that the world could start over. But peace never lasts forever. One night, late in September, Chad stood alone on the porch, coffee cooling in his hand. The fields were dark, only the lanterns from the barn still burning. He looked toward the horizon where the tree line met the hill and saw it. A faint flash, then another, too distant for thunder, too low for lightning. Claire stepped out behind him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "Storm?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. "Maybe," he said finally, though his tone carried the weight of doubt. In the distance, the air rolled with a low, dull rumble, not nature's kind, the kind a man remembers from war. Claire looked up at him, her face pale in the starlight. "Chad," he set his cup down slow, eyes fixed on the dark hills. "Tell Jacob to check the radios tomorrow, and tell Tanner to get those old traps ready and clear the old cellar pathways again." The wind shifted, warm air, turning cool, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke. Chad Thornburgh watched it for a long time, focused but heart steady. He'd promised himself he'd never see war again, but promises didn't always hold in a world still learning to stand. He turned toward the house, the lamplight spilling from the doorway where his family slept safe and unaware. "Built on faith," he murmured, "held by family." Then under his breath, almost to himself, "We are always ready for whatever comes next." The door closed behind him, and out across the horizon, the faint flashes continued, silent for now, but coming closer.